and welcome to the Capitola Planning Commission meeting. This meeting is open to the public with both in-person attendance at the City of Capitola Council Chambers at 420 Capitola Avenue and remote attendance possible. Planning Commission and staff are attending in person and remotely via Zoom. There are several ways for the public to watch and participate. Information on how to join the meeting via Zoom and make public comment during the meeting is available on our website, cityofcapitola.org, on the meeting agenda. The public can also live stream the meeting on the city's website or on YouTube. As always, this meeting is cablecast live on Spectrum Communications, Cable TV Channel 8, and AT&T Uverse Channel 99, and is being recorded to be rebroadcast on the following Mondays and Fridays, 1 p.m. on Spectrum Channel 71 and Spectrum Channel 25. Excuse me. A recording of the meeting will also be available on the city's website after the meeting. Our technician tonight is Walter. And as a reminder, please turn off your cell phones during the meeting. The horse. And so moving on, we need the roll call on the Pledge of Allegiance. All
right. Commissioner Westman. Commissioner Wilk.
Here.
Vice Chair Jensen, excuse me.
Present.
And Chair Christensen.
Here.
Commissioner Esty is absent.
Okay, moving on to item 2, additions and deletions to the agenda.
There are no additions or deletions to the agenda. However, we are going to ask that we reorder the topics tonight to begin with topic number 4.
Okay, and item 3 is oral communications. Oral communications allows time for members of the public to address the Planning Commission on any consent item on tonight's agenda or on any topic within the jurisdiction of the city that is not on the public hearing section of the agenda. Members of the public may speak up for up to 3 minutes unless otherwise specified by the chair. Individuals may not speak more than once during oral communications. All speakers must address the entire legislative body and will not be permitted to engage in dialogue. A maximum of 30 minutes is set aside for oral communications. Is there anybody that wish to speak? If you could put your name on.
Hi, my name is Goran Klopic. I live here locally in Santa Cruz County. What I'm about to tell today is that there is a certain police corruption here in the county going on. I'm not sure, I cannot prove it yet, but I'm talking about drug trafficking and prostitution. I talked about that to a captain here in Capitola, and I didn't hear back from her. I'm not sure how to go on from here. I'm having problems with other deputies because I've been talking about certain issues here, not the CPD, but other deputies from other counties who are harassing me. So I'm not sure about that either, but I can do. Thank you very much for listening. God bless you all. Take care.
Thank you very much. Anybody else like to speak? Is there anybody on Zoom? Or do we take? Okay. Item 4 is Planning Commission and staff comments. Or we're um, replacing number 4, removing something?
Oh, I'm sorry. So topic 4 within the regular section 6A. So no changes for this number 4. So Planning Commission staff comments. Staff has no comments this evening. Actually, I have 2 comments. City Council next week, there are, they will also be discussing the housing element update and the request for the 75 feet at the mall. And they will also be discussing the strategic plan. There were questions that came up at our last planning commission on that. So I would encourage you all to tune in. The staff report will be published tomorrow with more information on the strategic plan. And sounds like it's going to be a lot of stakeholder outreach. The planning commissioners will all be involved in the process. But Chloe is the project manager on that, our assistant to the city manager, and she'll be giving an overview on that. So I would suggest that you all tune in, and also that the zero emission passenger rail and trail, there'll be a presentation on that to the city council next week. So a lot of planning discussions that I would stay tuned. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
I can,
Uh,
mind.
Yes.
So I just want to say thanks for this workshop, because I think some of my comments last meeting were perhaps a little bit controversial. I didn't mean to, when I was talking about landscaping and some of these things, I didn't mean to undermine staff or the direction they gave to the applicant. Obviously, that's their job to interpret the code and give a good direction, which they did. And it's because I have trouble understanding some of these rules in the gray areas. I need a workshop doesn't mean that staff isn't telling the applicant what they need to hear. So I apologize for any confusion there.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else? No? Commission comments? Nope. Okay. Moving on to the consent calendar. All matters listed under the consent calendar are considered by the Planning Commission to be routine and will be enacted by one motion in the form listed below. There'll be no separate discussion on these items prior to the time of Planning Commission votes on the actions unless Planning Commission requests specific items to be discussed for separate review. Items pulled for separate discussion will be considered in the order listed on the agenda. Item A, approval of December 7th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting minutes. Yeah, let's do that.
I move approval of the meeting minutes for 12/7/2023 and 1/18/2024.
We have a first and a second. Roll call.
Commissioner Wilk.
Aye.
Vice Chair Jensen.
Aye.
And Chair Christensen.
Aye. Moving on to items or item 6, public hearing. Public hearings are intended to provide an opportunity for public discussion of each item listed as a public hearing. The following procedure is as follows. First is staff presentation. Second is planning commission questions. Third, public comment. Fourth, planning commission deliberation. And fifth decision, excuse me. Item A, we have the citywide zoning code update. The project description is for future amendments to the Capitola Municipal Code Title 17 zoning. The future zoning code ordinance amendments will impact the development standards and regulations for properties citywide. The zoning code is part of the city's local coastal program, and amendments require certification by the California Coastal Commission prior to taking effect in the coastal zone. Recommended action: provide feedback to staff on zoning discussion items and direct staff to prepare an ordinance to amend Capitola Municipal Code Title 17 zoning.
Thank you, Chair Christensen. I'm going to jump into the work session. So tonight we're having a work session on just a few planning documents and roles. Then we're planning to go into the zoning code update topics. and just items that the planning commission had identified at our last meeting that they'd like to talk about, and then broader planning discussion items. We're going to switch around the schedule here and start off with the zoning code update topics. At least the first topic of the mall. And then after that, I'll look to the planning commission to see if, I think we should probably at that point, start at the beginning of the presentation. I am wondering do we have Ben Noble on the line?
We do.
Okay, so Ben Noble is joining us from Ben Noble Planning. He has historically helped us with updates to the planning code, or zoning code. So is Ben an active panelist at this point?
Yes,
Okay. So if at any time you see Ben raise his hand or however we want to, he might jump into the conversation as well, as he knows Capitola very well. So mall redevelopment and incentives. I added this to our agenda after hearing the items that the planning commission wanted to discuss, because it's a kind of a pressing item under our housing element currently with the last letter that we received from the state. And we have identified within our housing element update a commitment to updating this section of code, which is for incentives for community benefits. Currently, this section includes, it establishes which incentives are allowed in exchange for community benefits. Mall redevelopment has its own section within this code, and mall redevelopment qualifies as a community benefit. The current incentives are an increased height from 40 feet within the regional commercial up to 50 feet as the incentive, and the floor area ratio can increase from 1.5 to 2.0. So within the housing element, we have identified 645 housing units on the Merlone Geyer properties within the mall. There's more on the mall as a whole, but 645 within the Merlone Geyer portion. And it's important to know that within the Merlone Geyer property, they have long-term leases on portions of that land. So when we look at the overall square footage that Merlone Geyer owns, in this next housing cycle, they're not able to develop on top of the Kohl's. They're not able to develop on the parking next to the Target parking lot. They're also not able to redevelop by the entryway of Macy's that is on the interior of the mall. So when you do the math, when you back it out, it's a much smaller land area than what you see when you look at their total number for the property. So of the 645 units that are identified in the housing element, 419 of those units are for affordable units. We worked with our housing consultant. We looked at the smaller size of the lot based on the long-term leases. And the consultant found that it is feasible within the 50 feet to build 645 units. However, when you look at the economics of the site, it may not be economically feasible to develop with 419 affordable units. So additional development is likely necessary to make this project economically feasible. So we've received several letters throughout the housing element update with a request from the mall owner to look at increasing the height up to 75 feet. And also, when we did the math of increasing the height to 75 feet, this would result in somewhere between 1,000 to 1,300 units based on whether or not the first floor commercial, and utilizing an equation that's provided by the state HCD we have no density on that property. So the mall is also within their letters, they've asked for an exception within the floor area ratio to not count the parking garages. And right now, as things continue to change at the state level regarding parking and being next to a high frequency transit area, it's most likely that parking in the long run will not be required at the mall by the state as the frequencies of our transit increase. So this exception request could be a great incentive for the mall to produce more parking than is required in the future. And then the other thought to keep in mind is that the visual impacts of height and parking garages, they can be mitigated through our objective design standards. I think that's maybe something we also need to just fine tune, thinking about going to greater height. So I have a series of slides that I got out to you early, so I know you've seen these. I don't want to spend too much time going over the projects, but 50 Felker Streets, it's 63 feet high, 5 stories, and 35 units. This is 130 Center Street. It's 74 feet in height, so this is similar to the request by the mall. It's 6 stories tall. There's 233 units. These are all single room occupancy units, and they do have commercial on the ground floor. And here's a side view. Of note is when you're building to 75 feet or these taller structures with retail on the ground floor, typically like a minimum of 15 feet is what you would see on that ground floor level when it's commercial. And sometimes you would see upwards of over 20 feet on the ground level, like 18 to 20. This is 324 Front Street, Cruise Hotel. It's 75 feet tall. So again, it's the equivalent of what's being asked for at the mall. 75 feet tall, 6 stories, 232 rooms. And again, you can see that ground floor commercial, and they've actually parked it underneath. Yeah, the red line is the grade on that one. Next, I've included a slide for the Capitola Mall. This is from the 2019 conceptual review, and this view is at 75 feet where you're seeing the top of the roof. 6 stories with 1 story of commercial. And within the Capitola Mall, the overall project was 637 units. And then this is just another angle of the Capitola Mall. Here it's 75 feet, 7 stories. On this side this was the street that was the extension of 38th Avenue that would go through the residential portion, not showing the commercial. To the left, you can see a garage door on the left bottom corner. This for that building in this previous slide also, there's parking wrapped by this building. So you can't see the parking garage, and it's wrapped with residential and commercial. 820 Pacific Avenue. This one goes up to 80 feet, 7 stories in height and 85 units. Again, it has a ground floor. I think the first 2 floors of this are commercial and office space. And here again, you're seeing those a 16-foot height on the first story and then 12 feet for the office, and then going up with 10-foot heights. 100 Laurel Street, this measures at 82 feet, 7 stories tall with 205 units, again, ground floor commercial. And they also have underground parking. And then 530 Front Street goes up to 89 feet, 8 stories, 276 units, as well as about 7,000 units of commercial. And here are 15-foot ground floor commercial, this building. So the second part of the request was for the floor FAR exception for the parking garages. I was just going to walk you through the previous mall design where you see the 2 cars is where the garages are. The top garage that was closer to Target, 1 wall of that was not wrapped. And on the lower garage, the building I already showed you, the building wasn't entirely wrapped for around their garage. So these are just showing the differences, the comparisons of a wrapped building versus one that you can see is visible. On the lower slide, you can actually see this 2-story Target parking garage. That's that red line. It's the 2nd story of the Target garage, and then the unwrapped. So I think in moving forward with this request, we would want to think about if we were to make an exception to it, just that it be integrated into the design of the building so that just the context of it is that what's shown on the top is achieved. So the Planning Commission discussion tonight is for the increased incentives for the mall site with a request of maximum building height to 75 feet, floor area ratio exception. Tonight, I'm not looking for a vote. There is not an ordinance in front of you. There is not a housing element update in front of you. This is a work session item. I just, in preparation of where we go next with our housing element, this feedback will help direct that of what we come back for options. But at this point, for the housing element, we're working on drafts, and the state HCD is really asking us to commit to a number in our housing element, and we'll only do that with the support of my planning commission and city council. So that's why I'm bringing this to you tonight, and I welcome the discussion. And again, there's no vote, and this is
Hear from our representative of the, do you want to talk to us first before we can talk about this, or? Sure.
Hi there, my name is Dave Geiser. I'm the Managing Director of Design and Construction from Malone Guy Partner. I've been with the firm for 25 years. I was a participant with Kathy and others bringing the original proposal forward back in 2019, I think was the last time we met. We have been participating or wanting to participate in the housing element process. That's why we've been presenting letters to what changes we think need to be made in order for us to process the number of units that we're talking about. In fact, these are even greater numbers than we were proposing originally. So we thought that there need to be changes made to the zoning to allow for such development. I would honestly, candidly say that the proposal we had in 2019, to keep in mind, that's not the proposal today that we're bringing forward. We don't have an application today. And so I would say that we would likely, especially given some of the comments we received at the end of 2019 about integration of other amenities to the site and other design issues, that we would probably go back, not totally to the drawing board, but we would re-envision the site with the zoning that was, if it's changed, what that says and what that allows us to do today. And also the different economic conditions today. Retail has changed a little bit, office changed greatly. The retail landscape in general has changed quite a bit. And our economic situations changed a little bit with our interest rates and where we're going with the economy. Things have changed. The landscape has changed for development. So I just say, keep that in mind, that we're not asking you, we're asking for zoning flexibility or increase in zoning, not necessarily zoning to fit the project that was presented in 2019. We would revisit that. So we're anxious to be a part of the process. We were invited here tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. We're here to listen to and provide the feedback that you need from us. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I was actually going to suggest that we do the floor area exception first, because I think that might be pretty simple.
Okay.
I did want to let you know that Commissioner Esty reached out. He sent a note to both the chair and I saying that he had reviewed the staff report, and he's done some analysis on his own that he shared with me in the past on the economics of the mall. And he's in support in general of the direction requested by the mall and understands that economically he feels it's necessary. So just wanted to let you know those comments as we go into this.
Well, I'll start on the floor area rate, because for me, that's a no-brainer. I think it makes absolute sense, because what's happening is that people are providing less and less parking. The state's requiring less and less. And I think for the mall to be successful because of what it is and what it's going to become, they're going to need to have some parking. And I think not having a parking garage included in the floor area ratio might even make other projects that weren't going to do parking originally because of cost and size that they needed to have their building to do. So I think it's a brilliant idea to take the parking garage out of the floor area ratio. So that's.
I agree, but I think I could just make some general comments about the whole project. Because I was on the planning commission in 2019 when they came before us originally. and also was there in city council, and generally I wouldn't say it was hostile, but it was very critical of the design at that point, mainly because of economic issues of the city. In other words, it was a wash in terms of whether or not we would get any funds from this. The increase in public works uh, outweighed the increase in sales revenue. So basically, the outcome from the planning commission as well as city council was you got to put a hotel in there in order to get some revenue. However, that was before we had this housing element requirement and the requirement to increase our population. At that time, we had a general plan that said keep the population of Capitola at 10,000, and we don't want a 25% increase. Well, now that that is mandated, that changes at least my approach to Merlone Geyer 180 degrees. And I just want to say thank you for um, providing this additional housing, and I am okay with the additional floor area ratio. I am also okay with the additional height requirements, and feel that this, in fact, is a great opportunity for us to get our housing element approved if we can get something going with Merlone Geyer, and I'm not going to be one to stand in the way of their project. It was also always a beautiful project. I mean, and they were very cooperative with community outreach and comments that we all brought forward, bicycles, you name it, bicycle pathways and bus routing, and they were very receptive. So I'm sure that that good relationship will continue, and we should be as cooperative as we can be with the new reality.
One question, what does this have to, interaction with these, suggestions and stuff, Katie, with what the city council is also doing with the outreach of like, I think they're looking at it, I don't know what the correct terminology is, but wasn't there, a lot of money that they have hired a consultant to work to make the project more advantageous to come forward? Is that interlap with this? Is that override? Is this one of the items that are in that? Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, so you'll recall that we kicked off a study of a land use study on how to different types of land use strategies that could be implemented to help with the redevelopment of the mall. That study is happening now. Cosmont is working on that. This very much aligns with their findings or what they're researching. I did reach out to them at the end of last week to let them know about I brought them up to date as soon as we got the letter back from HCD. And one of the ideas that they have been working on is looking at adjusting our heights is probably one of the more viable options that's really easy to do, rather than they're looking at ideas of like specific plans and other types of land use products. But this is in alignment with the study that they're doing, but at this time, they're not in a position to move forward with giving the results of the study, but this is definitely one of the tools that they will be suggesting.
I just want to make sure it was conflicting with where they're going, and at the same time, are they going to be altering their focus of that study if this is something that has a lot of support at planning level? Would this be something that, be it that they hired a consultant, would this be like, if that was one of their big recommendations, would they be focusing their energy on looking at other things that are going to be making it unique and advantageous for the applicant to, and other creative ways of working through this?
Yeah, I mean, they're continuing to put together the menu of options for us, so that will still be included in the study.
And just question, when we talk about the height maximum, and some of those photos, I know they're of other buildings and stuff, would that be like, roof level and then like some of them had decks on the top? So when we're talking about the height of the building, would that be height and then it'd be accessible, or are we looking at just plate height, or what are we really looking at from that standpoint?
So I think for the purposes of tonight, to say if we were to figure out if 65, 75 seems adequate to get into the general plan, we would get into the specificity of that during the zoning code update. So if the general plan says 75 feet, I don't think we would get that specific to say, and an extra 5 feet for mechanical equipment or any of that. We can fine tune that when we get to the planning commission for the zoning code update. Typically, though, it would be 75 feet to the roof, and then you typically do have exceptions for mechanical um, and elevator shafts and other necessary components of a building that aren't really used for a habitable space. And if the planning commission wanted to allow roof decks, that could also be included in that allowance beyond 75 feet, but we wouldn't need to get that specific this evening.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It sounds like we're going to talk about both of them together, not just the floor area ratio. So, I'm actually pretty comfortable with raising the height limit. My hope is that when the mall does look at their design, they'll try and put the highest part of the project closest to the center of the site as they can. And I know there's some restrictions on where it could go. I think from, listening to our community and what happened in 2019, I think there would still be some resistance, for example, having 75 feet right on Capitola Avenue. But if it was, the third story going up to 75 feet, or there was commercial on the bottom that, created a more pedestrian kind of feel, then I think those are ways that, we can work with the community and the developer to come up with something that's going to, provide the needed housing and provide the economics that the mall developer is going to need to make this project work. And as Commissioner Wilk said, times have changed. Certainly, when that mall was first built, in the 80s, it was the cat's meow, and retail was a completely different game than it is now. And so I think we all have to be open-minded and willing to, see what creative ideas they can come up with to make that property be, talking the mic, sorry, make that property work for them as well as the community. And just having that amount of housing on it's going to make it a completely different site than it is now. So I think everyone's anxious to see something happen there. I think people are more flexible now than they were before, and hopefully something can come of all of this where we have a project that financially works for the mall and design-wise works for the city.
Question about the 75 feet. So this would be just for that site, or would we extend that like all along the 41st Street corridor?
So if you wanted to discuss it going beyond the mall site, we could. Tonight, I was just asking specifically to the mall site, and that being everything within the Clare Street loop, Capitola Road and 41st Avenue. So not including like Trader Joe's and Brown's Ranch, but really inside the interior mall site.
It just occurred to me because I spent a lot of time in Redwood City and along El Camino Real. There's been a lot of development with these types of, you know, residential over retail, 5, 6 stories, and um, to me, it doesn't seem overbearing or, well, it just seems to be this is the way the world's going. So to have one one site approved for that seems to me like, well, we might as well just reestablish that, create a zone, more of a whole zone as opposed to just one site where we would allow that. Like here is our high density area. Obviously, we would spill over into the jewel box or anything, but perhaps just, on Capitola Road, just north of 41st Street and along 41st Street itself, perhaps even only on one side. But I think it would be worthwhile to expand the thought beyond just this one indication. The other thing I noticed was that forgot to mention earlier was the open versus wrapped parking. Obviously, the wrapped parking looks better, but isn't an open parking like the Target existing parking lot? Isn't that an issue of like safety and just auto exhaust fumes? Getting in decent air and getting a nice open space where there's lots of natural light. Maybe it reduces crime, or there might be issues other than just aesthetics where you'd want open parking or unwrapped parking.
I don't have the answer to that, Peter. So that's something we can look at. We can ask questions about. But just for clarification on your question regarding the zone, within the housing element, one of the items on our to-do list is to look at the boundary of the incentivized zone and possibly expand it down 41st Avenue to include more of the retail and commercial area. So that is one step, and we could talk about within that discussion, like how far this incentive, the additional height, where that should carry. We can definitely have that conversation during the zoning code update. I don't think we want to commit to too much. Typically, you would never put a height limit in a general plan document, but because we're being asked to by the state in order to get certification, we're here today. But so I think that is a great discussion. I think we should bring it up though when we get to that point that we've got a zoning code in front of you with the modifications.
I haven't heard from Court.
As far as the parking garages I guess this is the question I have for Roland Geyer, excuse me. A lot of in the presentation, there's a lot of subterranean parking. Is there any consideration for that if there was an exception, the FAR exception? Or is it going to be mainly wrapped and elevated?
Typically, subterranean parking is never included in the FAR. It's only above ground structures anyway. So we wouldn't look for that to be included anyway. So it wouldn't really be part of the exception. It's just that if we have an FAR cap, we don't have to count the parking structures. We get to build more housing.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to. So by not having to include them, and it's actually changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions you don't count parking structure in the FAR. Others you do. And so it's just that as we're looking to build more housing, if we don't have to, and in order to achieve what we want to do here, it's all surface parking today. None of it's included in the FAR. As we have to take that parking that's not included in the FAR and go vertical with it, we don't want to be penalized against building more housing. And that's really what's behind driving this. But subterranean parking, typically, we wouldn't do subterranean parking here. It just doesn't, unless we had to push one level down, maybe for a residential building, we typically wouldn't build subterranean parking. The question on the parking, the openness, that retail parking likes to be open, so people feel safe and it's bright. They're not there that long. Apartments or residential buildings, they like the security. So it's a controlled environment, and they're parking their car there for overnight or for longer periods of time. So they like the security. So they're less and you can handle ventilation with mechanical ventilations, but some amount of ventilation is nice. It's all about how you address the exterior. You try to aesthetically address the exterior of an exposed structure, which you can do, and you can do it nicely, which we try to do too. And I would expect that if it is exposed, that we would have to do something with sod. What we would expect. That answer your question, though?
Yes,
Okay.
and one more actually before you go sit down. I remember back in 2019, there was a lot of concern about how tall the buildings were as they were up against the sidewalk in the street. Is that with the increase of with the exception for the parking and the maximum height, is that going to be taken into account even with all these different changes?
I don't remember the way the code was written. I thought there was already a step back required in height from the street. I didn't think we could actually push the buildings to the street. In fact, so I think our proposed project actually did try to step back the buildings from the street, at least
Yeah.
at Capitola, we were getting closer.
Yeah.
We were pretty far away, but we would, we would not object, if there was some kind of a step back, some cities will actually do where you end up with 3 or 4 stories on the street and then you draw like a 45-degree line back, to get to, we're just looking for it to have 75 feet within the project where the housing gets built, and we would tend to push it towards the middle as well. If we, the most we can, but we would expect some kind of a setback requirement from the street, but we wouldn't be opposed to that.
Okay. Thank you.
One more comment. For me, I think the mall is one of the most important sites in Capitola, and I think it's one that the community would very much like to see developed. And I think the community is willing to make a lot of exceptions and concessions to have that site developed. So for me, I would stick right now with the 75 height limit for the mall project because, I don't think we want to create a situation where we get a big community uprising because we're going to do 75 feet everywhere and then the mall suffers from that. So for me, I would limit it right now to that one site, and then in the future, once we have that, look at expanding it to other places.
I agree. Commissioner Weston.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. It kind of falls back to a question that I know, Katie, you guys were working on doing some rendering drawings of a potential project and what it might look like at different sites. So this might be something that maybe we might want to look at if that was going to be a discussion with maybe that would be added on to see what that would also look like if we picked a site at 75 feet down 41st in the future, if that was going to be looked at. I think that'd be something interesting to study. At the mall, when we talk about stepping it back, I think it's a little bit different because there's so much space. But on a smaller confined lot, it'd probably look a lot different. Maybe if that was connected in the future, that'd be good.
Like having these aspects being contextually applied to each project is really helpful. So coming with, having the context of your past application and then the changes coming with the code, understanding where it's going to go really helps shape the project from our perspective and I think the community's input. Does anyone have anything else? No?
Okay. Well, that's extremely helpful. So, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. So with that, shall we go back to the policy and role discussion? I'll try to keep that really brief. It's 6:45. And then I think if we try to be back on, and there'll be a really in-depth discussion on Arc Insight that's included in there. And then maybe if our goal is to be back, I'm looking at 6:45, try to be back on zoning code topics within 15 to 20 minutes. Does that sound reasonable? So I'll keep my presentation really short because I know you've looked through the presentation ahead of time. So we discussed what our work session is about. Our recommended action tonight is to provide feedback on discussion items, direct staff to prepare ordinance amendments. I have a homework assignment for you for our next work session. You had asked I think it was actually Commissioner Esty asked for examples of what is good and bad massing. And I would love for those to come from the planning commissioners, and I'll put them into a slide deck and you don't have to identify if it's good or bad. I'll pull up the picture and we can discuss it because I don't want that to just come from me or from staff. It seems more appropriate to since it's a work session. I'd love to see your examples of good and bad. And they don't have to be in Capitola. So, but so the background really quick, the zoning code update, we went through a process. I think it from start to finish was about 6 years by the time we got it certified by the Coastal Commission in 2021. We did updates in late 2022, and that was certified by Coastal Commission earlier of 2023. We're now into our 6th cycle housing element, and we just discussed that portion. So jumping on. So the first topic tonight was just, let's take a step back and really look at the big picture of planning and what we do here. What's the purpose and effect of the zoning code, the relationship between the general plan, the local coastal program, and the zoning ordinance. So the zoning code, which is the rules of the road that we follow every day in these meetings. The purpose of that is to implement the general plan, which is our long-range planning document. It's our blueprint for the future of Capitola, and also implement the local coastal program land use plan, which is the long-range planning document tied to the Coastal Act and our land use program, and to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. So the general plan element, or the general plan within it, there's 8 elements. One is the land use element. And within the land use element, we designate what can be done in different parts of the city regarding residential, commercial, industrial, open space, public facilities, mixed use. And getting more specific within those zones, or those areas, it guides development regulations for each of those land uses and our overall land use policy. This next slide lists the goals in our housing element. I'm going to try to move this. Okay, there we go. I won't read this slide to you, but I've put in bold some of the key terms that are repeated throughout the general plan, the land use, the LCP, and within our zoning code. And you're going to see the sense of place, the historic and cultural resources, sustainability, transportation alternatives, the special character of our residential neighborhoods, new residential, and making sure it respects scale, density, and character. The village as the heart of Capitola, high quality and distinctive design, the transformation of the Capitola Mall. So those are some of the first 9 goals within our, again, high quality development along 41st Avenue, active and inviting, thinking about thriving destinations in Bay Avenue, the utilization of City Hall and the parking lots as a benefit to the community, our public facilities that enhance the quality of life. Quality of life is something that comes up throughout our general plan and our zoning code. And again, high quality public parks, recreational programs, high quality of life. So just there's, and when the general plan was rewritten and adopted in 2013, there was a committee that Susan, I'm guessing you might have been participated in that. Peter, Jerry, did either, Courtney? But there was a group, I want to say, was it 22 citizens that? Mhm. And Noble was involved, yeah. So it was a several-year project. There was a lot of public outreach to the community, lots of the engagement. And so that document and those words are something that it was a big undertaking over many years by the city. Within our LCP, our coastal program, and the long range planning document, that's really about how we bring in the guidance within our general plan. But our land use plan it's actually older than the general plan, and it's really tied to coastal access and programs. But when you go into that document, it is on our website under our long range planning. There's a lot of those words about like the village being the heart and historic preservation and keeping access to our coastline and what a special place Capitola is and should be preserved. So those are a lot of the same terms. And then as you get into our zoning code, under the purpose statements of the zoning code, again, I won't read these off to you, but quality of life, charm, range of housing choices, and coastal access, preservation, balance your transportation. So again, just reiterating, there are just themes throughout for Capitola that is kind of our guidance documents for implementation. So that's the overview of how those 3 items work together. And then zoning, of course, gets much more specific with all the rules to tie back to those purpose statements and goals. The second topic was the administrative responsibility and staff's role in the application and review process. And so within the zoning code, it is, well, actually, if you go back to like the state government code, it's very specific that the city council, planning commission, and community development director, we function as the planning agency for the city of Capitola, which is required under state code, that we have a planning agency. And then the next page, I'm going to show you the table, which shows the review and decision-making authority. So this is from table 17.108, and it just gives you different, on the left-hand side, different types of applications that come in front of the planning commission. I'm going to go to sign permits and design permits as examples. And the community development director, that makes up of myself and Brian and Sean, the planners. We provide the recommendations on sign permits and design permits. For, as an example, the planning commission is the review board who makes a decision on those applications. And then city council ultimately is the appeal board if the decision needs to go there. And we are tasked with, under those examples for a design permit, that staff makes a recommendation to the planning commission. So we go through the zoning code, we look at what is in the zoning code and what is whether or not a project complies, and then that's what we bring to the planning commission in terms of making that recommendation. And planning commission makes the final decision. The third topic is administrative responsibility, design review process, and the committee makeup. So for the purpose of design review, the current process, which we changed in the 2021 update, was prior we had an architectural and site review process. The new process was put in place to kind of streamline the process because of the timing it took between the 2 meetings to get to a planning commission, and just streamline it with more oversight on larger projects for multifamily and commercial. So the current process is that city staff and city contracted design professionals provide preliminary recommendations to the applicant on the design permit prior to a planning commission review. And then through the review process, the staff and the contracted design professionals, we work with the applicants to produce the best possible project design consistent with the city policies and regulations prior to the hearing by planning commission. We do not take action, we make recommendations. And then once it gets to planning commission takes action on all applications. The participants, for the majority of the applications that you see of single family, that's made up of city staff involving planning, public works, and the building department. We also at times contract landscape architects, and architectural historians for those larger, for significant or sensitive projects, which I can require that we integrate others because they're sensitive or significant. But a city contracted architect is required for a design review process for all new proposed multifamily and non-residential construction projects. So you often see with our multifamily that we hire RM Design and they give a breakdown, as well as on commercial projects that require a design permit. So with that, got the 3 topics there, and we can maybe start with topic number 1. If there's any questions or any clarification that anyone wants to hit upon for topic 1.
I have just 2 general questions before we get going. When you say like a commercial project, you said goes to RM, does the review, and they're contracted obviously by the city, and then the applicant pays those fees.
Yes.
And they're selected through a process, like RM selected by the city? I mean, who, was it an RFP that went out? And
Yeah,
was
we
selected?
actually put out an RFQ, a request for qualifications. And they were we had a couple applicants, some backed out, and we utilized RM through that process.
And just so I know, just context wise, how long have they been, are they just ongoing?
Yeah, you have to renew, but they've been ongoing for, since we started the new process.
Right. And then one other question, how does that, when the city's looking at doing a strategic plan, how's that gonna overlay on some of these? I mean, not exactly in zoning code, but with the strategic plan, how does that affect each one, any of these, or do you know how that, envision how that's gonna work?
So for the strategic plan, I think that will affect, it'll have an impact when we redo some of these documents. But at this point, it would have no effect on this because it's more of a, kind of the city operations and a strategic plan of how like decision making is made within the city. So if I'm really not sure how to answer that yet, to be honest, because it's being presented to city council next week of exactly what it is. But if at the end of the day, I can give you one example of a strategic plan that I participated in at another city. The city came up with, within their strategic plan, 4 levers that every application should be measured against. So one was like small town, history, maybe affordable housing was in there, and I can't quite remember all 4. But anytime when we would write staff reports, we would actually put those levers into the staff report and how a project would or would not align with kind of the levers of the city. So that's one way it's been implemented in the past, but at this point, I'm not exactly sure how the strategic plan, if it's going to be tied more towards how the city makes decisions around the budget or land use programs or everything. So I'm just,
I thought that's like an important part, like as we start to go through this, is this strategic plan starts to, and it looks like it's pretty fast tracking. So if it's going to set like a new vision or a new outline for the city come November, you know, I was just trying to see how that was going to, I was just confused on the interaction between that to all these different things that we'll be talking about and, potential changes and stuff like that. So.
I think if you bring it closer.
And won't change the general plan or the local coastal plan or the zoning ordinance. Those will all still be as they are now. It seems like the strategic plan might say that one of our goals would be to, update the general plan or change certain things, but the plan itself won't actually implement any of those. And I think, having been involved in it before, not only in Capitola, but in other cities, like, changing the general plan is a long, long process. So maybe it'll set out some, guidelines in there, but it within itself doesn't change those documents, which I think we all sort of forget, even I forget how much state law sort of regulates how zoning and general plans work.
Thank you.
So my comment on the 3 documents involves subjectivity versus objectivity, right? So this state has come down as we go through the housing element, whatnot, saying, well, you need to have objective criteria. And so when we have statements like small town feel and coastal village charm, we may have a sense of what that is, but we somehow really need to create objective requirements. And I think we have to a certain extent in the zoning code with, setbacks and roof lines. And we've gone in and tried to put objective requirements in there. But I do feel that we need to be vigilant about that and try not to let aesthetics and personal opinions um, creep in creep into these decisions too much, and oh, I don't think that's, the European feel of the village, or I don't like Spanish tile roofs, or whatever it is. I mean, you can use the term small town feel and coastal village charm as a loophole to have all kinds of requests, right? So I think in general, my concern or my desire is to continue to work on objective criteria and minimize the subjective criteria. So that's
On that point, I know that when when you want an applicant or, in future development to have certain attributes, we can incentivize, for example, I'm trying to trying to articulate this. In past applications, there's been issues with flat roofs in town, in the village. And there's nothing that I've seen that we could, if the city wanted pitched roofs, say, or some type of gable roof, having those types of standards in the code would be helpful. Saying that if you're incentivizing a pitched roof by measuring the height differently, saying from the midspan of the rafter, and I've seen that in other municipal code, where if they wanted a gable roof, you could say, okay, it's a 30-foot height limit from midspan if it's a certain pitch, and that
have that 25 feet and for a flat roof, and then you want
Yeah,
to
we do that. We do that in the village. We have the incentive where you can have a higher height if you do, a roof rather than doing a flat roof. I think that's all in the village design guidelines. I don't think it's applies to like the R1 zoning district in those areas, but I
Yeah,
could be
it
wrong.
doesn't apply right across the street here, but it does apply just within the mixed use village, not mixed use neighborhood.
okay. I mean, just stuff like that. I feel like that would be how to kind of clarify the objective standard, making it pretty direct as to what we want. And if you want to propose something else, that's fine, but you have, the curated standards describe it in a different way as, as something that it's not necessarily not allowed, but it's not preferred kind of thing. Is that, I mean, use, yeah.
I'll let you finish that.
Am
Oh,
I
no,
saying that right?
I guess I don't understand it because I think, I don't know if we're agreeing or disagreeing, because things like flat roofs, you could say, well, that's not desirable because you could maybe have a daylight plane
Yeah.
requirement that says, the houses on Capitola Road here are just two big blocks, and if you're on Riverview and you look, suddenly you have no sunshine in the morning, and so you could have daylight plane requirements in there, and we do have some. So I think the notion of small town feel and coastal village charm, you can just continue to look at the kinds of requirements we already do have and say, well, all right, it meets all of those. And if we want to go further and say, maybe we don't like Spanish tile roofs or some crazy thing, we should actually put that in the code and again, quantify it. So I love Spanish tile roofs, but
And
So one comment I will make, I've been involved in planning for a lot of years, and I do think that in some ways, particularly in a document like a general plan, which stays around, for 10, 15, sometimes 20 years, it's nice to have some language in there that's not absolutely defined because times change and things change. We've seen a huge change in Capitola Village over the last 10, 15 years, and not because the city's really done anything differently, but the impact of people coming from Silicon Valley here, more people, more population. And so I know some of those terms are vague, but I think it gives the community some flexibility to make some discussion and different opinions as they go. I mean, I'll be honest, probably 20 years ago, I wouldn't have voted for a project that I voted for at the last planning commission meeting, because at that time, the community was, pretty hard and fast with the direction they wanted to go in. So I think people's opinions change, and not everything can be black or white and measured. You have a design review process for that reason. You can't have everything written down and say, if the building's this height, if it's this wide, if it has 14 windows and there, this, then it's automatically approved. It's not as black and white as an awful lot of people would want it to be, but being sort of gray allows it to evolve over time as well.
Yes, I don't have an objection, and I agree that the general plan should be general and have general guidelines, but like this statement about the small town community is in the zoning code, that's, what we're supposed to be following, and I just think that the opportunity for, I don't know, the fashion police to jump in, it's just too tempting, and so we should try to resist that.
Okay. Thank you for those comments on that. And I think there is a balance between objective standards and guidelines and all of that. So I think we'll keep that in mind and thinking about the different parts within the general plan. 41st Avenue and what we just had the discussion on the mall site is very different from the discussion of Future Heights and Depot Hill so I think kind of outlining where those envelopes is important and what can be done inside them. But we'll move on to topic number 2, administrative responsibility, staff's role in the application and review process. Pretty clear? Okay. And topic 3, administrative responsibility, the design review process and committee makeup.
Is this where we're going to talk about
Arkansas.
site review?
We all call it Arkansas still. It's like we development and design review committee.
Well, I would like to see, I know that the city abandoned the old Arkansas committee that was in place before, and there were, the reasons for that had a lot to do with it was difficult to get an architect who would or a building designer to donate their time to, is being paid $75 for the meeting was not really, paying them for their time. It was difficult to get people. It was difficult to get a landscape architect. It became, cumbersome. Like Katie mentioned, they would cancel meetings, and then the applicant couldn't go to the Arkansas committee. So then they couldn't get to the planning commission, and, months would go on. So it got changed to where basically that committee was abolished. And what we do now is that we hire a firm to look at the Arkansas aspects of multi-use, multifamily, and bigger, larger commercial projects. And for the single family homeowner, they now don't really have the opportunity to get all of that feedback very early on in the process. And we all know it's best for people to get that kind of feedback early, because it's easy to change your plans in the very beginning, or, sometimes people give you ideas that you hadn't thought of. I mean, it seemed to work for both applicants and, the committee, and by the time something got to the planning commission, they'd really worked out an awful lot of the issues that were going on. So I don't know how we go back, but I would like to see something that does take place, early on, and maybe has some sort of professional designer or, architect there be part of that group. So, there's early feedback on the design and how it's going to work. So that's my comment.
I think one thing I should clarify about the process that's in place right now is we get the application, then we've got 30 days to say whether or not it's complete. And the applicant will get feedback on just what's missing from your application so that they can resubmit. And that goes around to Public Works, Building, and Planning. So the incomplete letter goes out, and then once we have a complete application, it goes to Arc and Site, in which Planning, Building, and Public Works are in a meeting with the applicant. They can be in person or on Zoom, and we sit down and we go through their application, and if they need to tweak the stormwater plan, or if we notice they have a second story deck that needs some changes, that's when we go through that, is at that Arc and Site meeting. So we have, I just want to point out that in the last, I would say since about October, we've done things a little bit differently, and I'm hoping you're seeing that in the staff report, in that we've been sitting down as a team before the Arc and Site meeting and going through every design criteria within our code and identifying if we have any concerns and bringing those up. That was kind of what the architect that was their task within that meeting, and bringing them up hopefully early enough so that, with the idea of those suggestions being implemented or at least discussed before planning commission hearings. So that's relatively so it's a little more formal within our department, but just so you know where we're at today, because we have changed a little bit due to comments that we've heard from the planning commission over the last 6 months about the design reviews. So I just wanted to, that's the process of, there is one meeting with the applicants and all of staff, but no architect.
I'm not sure I see the value of having an architect. They hire an architect, usually, great plans. So now all of a sudden you need a committee to approve your house. I'm thinking mostly about R1. So I can understand where like a multi-family unit or a commercial building, where we might want that input, someone who understands the general plan and some of our goals. But when it comes to R1 individual homes, I'm not sure the value of a second architect's opinion, as long as we have competent staff that can go through the code and say, here are all the requirements. You meet those requirements, you only have one more hurdle to go through, and that's the planning commission.
So I'll just say from a personal experience, I guess about 11 years ago, our project that we took through, we had the planning architectural review board. I thought it was extremely beneficial. There were some challenges about our Pacific lot, and I found it very valuable. I think at that time it was Derek. It was Derek.
Derek, or I think it was Derek, and I think or Frank.
I think it was Derek. And there's some challenges that we had some, as the applicant, and had an architect on how we kind of thought. And it was valuable because we shared, I remember doing some sketches at that back table about another way of trying to achieve what we wanted to as an applicant and another point of view from an architect. And so I thought it was extremely beneficial. And so I thought the process was great. The people, I know a couple other people that went through, and it was a very positive. But I have heard other stories, that it delayed their project and stuff. So I think to figure out a way to streamline that, but at the same time to ensure that that process happens, I think as a planning commissioner, to know and to be able to read that report back of the review and what went on, and that it was like a working session, was very valuable. And I think it'd be valuable, again, with that at the same time, I'm just think it's so key for an applicant before they get too far down into a structural engineer. And then it comes at our level and we're talking, let's just say it's a window. It might just be a window to us as making a decision, but it could be a structural modification that could cost a lot of money from a structural standpoint, from a structural engineering something. And so try to work through those things early and at that level, I thought it would be a huge benefit to have it come back.
So I'd like to pull the string on that a little bit because it sounds like you and I had different experiences as we went through this process.
Yeah.
So when you went through it and you had the Derek or whoever it was,
Mhm.
the issues that you were talking about were, oh, I don't know, how do I get this driveway to fit here? Or how do I meet the permeability? Or can you suggest some materials for this or this? Because I don't know. I didn't know about this requirement. What do you suggest? I can see that being very helpful as opposed to, um, again, just some aesthetic requirement that says, you should have, shiplap siding instead of, shingles or something. And you say, well, okay, well, if that's what the community wants, I'll put in shiplap instead of shingles. And all of a sudden the planning commission says the opposite, it's two different experiences. And if it was a dynamic give and take where you were actually learning and getting understanding on how to meet requirements, I can see how that would be very helpful. And if that was your experience.
That's exactly what my experience was. On that, it was a working session and we worked through some challenges. And I think a lot of lots around here, are unique and they have challenges and be able to work those through. And, we had one like on Riverview that came up and, with the lot line, how could the, you know, uh, the driveway and turning radiuses and stuff, and they come to us at that level and, how, what is the turning radius for a car and that lot's tight? I mean, those are all things I think maybe another architect's perspective other than, I don't say as a mediator, but to try shed light to another professional that might be, my architect was with me at that time, but to share another point of view on something to try to work through some things. So I just think it's a community benefit, that for an applicant to go through it. I'd be sensitive to, if that delayed their project for any, reason. We all know carrying costs are extremely expensive for an applicant, but how can that be streamlined and to ensure that that process was fast? But in the long run, that it was beneficial for them to go through that.
I think you kind
Very
of
good.
hit the nail on the head. If it's just fast or efficient, I want to say consistent, where they get one set of comments from all the parties. They have one, resolution. Everything is consistent all the way through planning commission. It, you have the staff report that comes to all of these different conclusions, making the recommendation for approval, I think is really helpful for the applicant. And, all of those different design issues are addressed there. And then there's a proposed resolution and the applicant can either adhere to those resolutions or think of another argument to bring for some type of variance or whatever. But, I just think making it as efficient as possible for them is, I think, the overreaching theme moving through your application.
So you mentioned that in sort of like October, you started this new process. And from your perspective, does it seem to be working well? I mean,
I think so. I think we're working through more of the design issues up front with the applicant. I'm actually going to lean on Sean a little bit on this one because you've been implementing this. We've been having our meetings earlier. And what are your applicants? I think it's been, from my perspective, when I get to a staff report review, I know the project well. I know what feedback has been given to the applicant. I know whether or not the changes have been implemented after the development and design review. And I think it's been helpful because you're seeing our recommendations in the staff report too. So we're trying to be a little more transparent on what we're asking for from the applicant and also tied into the report, why. So what are those design standards that the reason why we're requesting additional information? So any comments?
I guess I'm wondering if there's sort of a hybrid model to this, because having seen the Architectural and Site Committee over a number of years, there have been good years and there have been bad years, because you know, it's like a planning commission. There are different people on it at different times. And I do have some sensitivity for Commissioner Wilk's comment, because there was a period when there was one architect on the committee who I think was more interested in having people design things the way he thought they should be designed, rather than you know, it being helpful to the applicant to try and solve the problems. So I'm wondering if it's possible to have like the committee that you have that you're working on, but if a project comes in where there's difficulty figuring out how to fit the structure on the lot, there's definite design problems. And as staff, because it does happen, you look at them and you go, oh, this is just never going to get approved. It's never going to work. It's, you know, these people have good intentions, but it's not going to happen. If we could have something where you have the flexibility of bringing in, you know, a design professional or an architect or something to help on those single-family homes early in the process. And sometimes you get people who say, well, I'm just not going to listen to staff. I just want to go to the planning commission because I don't think staff knows what they're talking about. And, you know, the reality is they normally do know what they're talking about and know what will be approved or not approved in the community. And so maybe something in between. I don't know.
I would like to err on the side of bringing it back, maybe listen to the experiences that weren't the positive ones that we had before, and not leave it so subjective that then what project does go and then doesn't go, and did that one should have went, and you know, I mean, so I thought, you know, maybe we modify the way it seems like there's, you know, comments about how it was ran before, and that was before, you know, so maybe how do we bring it back now and don't call it the same title, you know, and but that there is a new process that's brought in so that there's a little bit more involvement and clearing of perceptions and ideas at a lower level so that it's organized when it comes into planning, with some feedback that we could see a report that was cohesive with other input.
It's
Yeah, you know, we could bring back, we'll bring back options for a future discussion, because all of this needs to go in the form of a zoning code update if we're going to modify it. So I think we've definitely heard the different perspectives, and we'll bring back some options and within the update. Okay. Okay, it's now almost 7:30. Is there a time that you want to go to tonight? I just want to 8 o'clock stop? Let's reconnect at 8 o'clock and see where we're at.
Yeah.
Okay. A fun one. Upper floor decks. Is that right? Yeah, upper floor deck. So this is one of our most recent updates. And when we were doing the cleanup from the 2021, this was something new that was added to the code. I think one item that we definitely need to talk about is the privacy screen under D. But just quickly, upper floor decks in excess of 150 square feet is included in the floor area ratio. We would like confirmation, the way it's worded in our code under the floor area exception, it doesn't say if it's per deck can be up to 150 feet or 150 feet, or is it all of the decks? So if there are 3 decks and they add up to, each deck is less than 150 feet individually, but they add up to 400 square feet, what we've been doing is saying we take 400 feet and we subtract the 150 exception and we say the rest counts towards your floor area ratio. But we want to clean that up in the code, and we're looking for your perspective on that, if it should be 150 feet exception per deck or into all the decks combined. And it's only for second stories, not first.
And that's the way it is. That's the way,
That's how we've been administrating it, but we'd like to reword that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's the way that it's always been done, but I have an opinion. There's a,
Sure.
the one thing that having living space, exterior living space is really important, especially, I feel like down towards the village area, there's a high, base, flood line, like the base flood elevation, you have to build above. So considering, the base flood elevation could be between, from a foot to 3 feet to 6 feet, depending on how close you are, how low you're sitting. All of that exterior living space on the second story is now limited greatly. So I like that we've preserved the 150 square feet. It just makes it so, first, there's not a lot of exterior space, living space upstairs. And second, if you have a deck that just happens to be, 250 square feet upstairs, or that you wanted to strategically put it into your second level, you're now taking space away from bedrooms, bathrooms, kitchen, living, dining, anything else, any of the other massing in the house. So I just wanted to state that it's exterior living space is really important, and making that as available as possible with consideration to your neighbors and, sight lines and everything else is also important, but just not restricting people to the nth degree of trying to utilize that type of space.
So this section here doesn't apply to the central village, does it?
Is it not?
I don't think it applies. There's separate guidelines for the village. This section is talking about,
I mean, well,
because the village is different than this section of Capitola.
right, but even across the street, there's a high base flood elevation. I mean, just on Capitola Avenue in the MUN. and-
So it definitely applies right across the street. It's interesting. These standards are kind of out of place. They should probably be in our the other section. They're listed in our R1, but other zones do point to this section because right across the street, the mixed-use neighborhood, I believe, is subject to the second-story decks in the R1 zone standards. Oh, okay. Okay, so the FAR applies everywhere. That's the difference. But in the mixed use village, the FAR is a 2.0, so it wouldn't really have an impact. Across the street, the FAR is a 1.0, so it has an impact. So thank you. Sean just clarified that that first standard is also in our FAR, And that's why it applies throughout Capitola.
It seems like it might make some sense to look at this because I do think there's a difference between the, sort of R1 neighborhoods, particularly the, smaller ones like Jewel Box or Riverview Terrace. Um, and, maybe we need to get a little more neighborhood specific about second floor deck regulations.
Just considering the context of each, I don't disagree with how we have it stated. I just, in designing homes in the village or in the adjacent areas in the different sections.
Right. Well, the village is different, but it sounds like the adjacent areas to the village is not different.
Yes.
So what I'm hearing
it's-
is it's more tied to the size of the lot,
Yeah.
right? So Cliffwood Heights, where you're going to have a larger FAR,
It makes
we,
sense.
we don't think it, like, this is fine how it is
Mhm.
today. But on these smaller lots where every square inch matters, when you have a really small lot and therefore your FAR is lower, or your floor area is lower, then it really makes a difference with this. So maybe something similar to our driveway standards on small lots, having some type of exception, or not driveway, sorry, garage standards on small lots, maybe having an exception for decks on very small lots. Flip side of that is they'll be closer to property lines and
Right, I
neighbors.
was gonna
Yeah.
say in neighborhoods like Riverview Terrace where they're really small, then you get into a lot of impact and privacy issues. So that's why I go back to my point. I think maybe you need to look at almost by neighborhood by neighborhood.
I mean, it is very contextual. I just come up in my imagination, I'm thinking of like, okay, well, we have to build above habitable space above the base flood elevation, and now that's, you know, second level pretty much, and now we can't have exterior space beyond 150 square feet, and it just makes it so
Well,
limiting.
you can have it beyond 150 square
You
feet.
can.
It's just that it counts into your floor area
Mm.
ratio.
And then
And
you're
like Katie said, in the village, that number is higher. So it's not you don't have the consequences there that you have like across the street.
sure, yeah.
So,
One suggestion there is, I think when we first were looking at drafting this, we were talking about like social neighborhoods and having more front, like second story decks on the front of the home where it doesn't have such an impact on the neighbors, and maybe including another exception for front decks on the front of the home.
Yeah.
Because then you're not so worried about that.
And that,
isn't there a downside of that? I mean, if we're worried about our small town coastal charm, uh, we're actually allowing larger and larger buildings, right? Because now we're not going to count deck space, and so we're allowing outside living, but we're creating massing problems.
but how is it a massing problem? 'Cause I don't, and that's kind of my, how is it created, if you're creating a larger house with additional exterior space, um, you, I mean, you're gonna have to maximize every square inch of that allowable FAR to really utilize your parcel in parcels this size. I mean, is that, I kind of want more description of how the massing is an issue.
So, okay, so I guess if it's a zero-sum game,
I agree with Peter. If you're not going to count it in the floor area ratio, and you've got a small lot, then you're going to end up with a bigger building on that lot. But I also agree with Katie, maybe there are some ways that you can do that because, the deck on the front of a structure, it's going to be fairly open. That's not really adding me to the massing of the structure. So you do it.
I mean, I think a while ago we were talking about how the decks on the front or the second level exterior space on the front of the homes adds to the interaction of the street, and how, that creates more of a small town feel and a charming sense of, interaction of people on the street, people in the homes. And if we could allow for an exception in that regard, I think that would be really productive all the way around.
So there's a common design that you see out there. We've got a 15-foot setback on the first story and then a 20-foot setback on the second story. We have a requirement that the second story deck also has to meet that 20-foot setback. One thing we could do is allow the second story deck to be at the 15 feet where the first story begins.
Mhm.
And then so people could take advantage of that 5 feet area and have a social, hopefully sunny spot. And then maybe not count that 5 feet area on the front, within that setback area towards your floor area ratio, just to give more opportunity for outdoor, but something along those lines.
I think that would be really good for the entire city.
And then it assists with the small town charm.
If you're not like
If your neighbor is
All sides of
charming.
this, all sides of this, trying to be devil's advocate.
I like the idea of the reducing it, so, I mean, it's not gonna be any more pronounced than the first story. I mean, it'll just be at that plate line or at that wall.
Mhm.
I think that was,
So on a side note of that, I mean, you have a slide in here saying that second floor deck, if it's over living space, that's called a roof deck, and so that's not allowed?
No,
Oh,
It's
that's
over a roof?
roof decks are okay.
Roof decks are, the way
So
I always.
that's something we
interpret
need to, it was just, we have a cleanup item in our zoning code cleanup list.
it. Yeah,
That we want to clarify that the rooftop is really the rooftop and couldn't be interpreted as, the way it's worded is funny in the code, so that's just a cleanup item.
okay, that's a cleanup item.
Yeah. So I don't think there have been any issues with B, may not face an interior side parcel line abutting a lot within a single family, so you can't orient your deck towards your neighbor. Correct? That one's fine. Must
Question about the
comply with
privacy
the,
Screen.
what?
Question about the privacy screen. So we just had this discussion at the last meeting, right, about the privacy screen and 5 foot versus 6 feet versus 4 feet, whatever. To me, so we already have a setback on the side yard, right? It's more than just the normal 5 feet, whatever. We've got a second story setback.
10 feet.
So,
Mhm.
so to me, that's already provides privacy, that setback. So you don't need privacy screen or opaque glass on top of that. My opinion.
I agree with you. I
Agree?
agree, yeah.
Right.
But,
me, it's a case by case basis, just like windows in the side of the house. It's gonna look into the neighbor's yard, where are their windows? You're doing an infill kind of project, and how's it going to work? I mean, I think there are cases where, having a privacy screen like on this was just on the side of the deck, because the deck was facing toward the street. It makes some sense to have a privacy screen there.
Yeah, we could switch that from a shall to a may, and we can just reference that the planning commission may require a privacy screen.
that's productive because then it gives the neighbors some recourse if they do have an issue with it. Would that be?
Right. And one of my issues has always been, I don't think our decision should be based on the current neighbor. Because we're talking about trying to design structures that are gonna fit in our community and work well as good neighbors for the next, 50 years. And all of those neighbors are going to change. So some of our things like, having a privacy screen could be because, things are going to change. And so I'll get myself in trouble. I don't put too much credence in what one neighbor says right now. What we want to do is good planning for the future. And that's why, I think it's important, sometimes to have opaque windows in certain places so the property doesn't look down completely in the backyard of the house next door that's already there, because they can't change things, they're already there. Even if the neighbor says, well, I don't really care what they do. It's not about what that neighbor cares about. It's what's good planning practice for the future.
Agreed. I just like, just for example, the last application that we had come up with the big wall, I think that some advice, I think that designer had a bit of understanding of what the screen was, because it was a complete, I don't think it was appropriate to have a wall there, and to have a screen, if she just were to put up, either a vegetation screen or an opaque piece of opaque glass or something but that have that actually be listed and really clear. So it's not just like, oh, well, now we have to put a wall on that side of our deck. And it's just, I think that would be poor planning, because it seems to be such a misjudgment, a misplaced.
Right. I don't
feature.
think it needs to be a wall. I
Right,
think it
right.
needs to be some sort of privacy screen.
Of course, I just think that that should be very clear of what a privacy screen is, so these future designers don't misinterpret that and start building walls on the.
We did have words to that effect. at one
You know, I had to cut it out because just to fit in here, but it does say example opaque screen. We can elaborate on that to say vegetative screen, opaque screen.
I mean,
Is
just
it portable?
Is it portable?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying, like, if it's vegetation, I mean, that could be a planter and then. Go ahead, John.
I was just going to clarify that the code does express that it needs to be permanent. Yeah, I think that would infer that it can't be moved.
Yeah, and say for clarifying, and we're gonna give out recommendations, what is it, needs to be clear. 'Cause, if it's on the second story and it's a planter of vegetation, how is that really secured? I mean, you know. And I'd say, oh, it's a planter, and you stick it out there and say, well, it's full of dirt, it doesn't move, but it's, what I mean, so
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
cleaning that up a little bit, if that's where we go.
I'll be in a minority here and just say that I don't think that opaque windows and privacy screens are really necessary. I think setbacks are probably adequate. You want privacy, you can grow a hedge in your yard or close your drapes. And there's exceptions. Obviously, you don't want to be looming over some neighbor's yard and you knock your beer off your railing and it knocks your neighbor on the head or something. But for the most part, uh, I think we're too aggressive in terms of protecting people's privacies. Just my opinion.
I yeah, what I'm hearing is provide more examples. Let's look at it. Let's remove that this is a requirement, but that it's a may. The planning commission may require a privacy screen, and giving examples of what that is. And we're not going to add a specific height. Is there any discussion on that? It's a maybe, and the planning commission can decide case by case basis. And it should really be integrated into the architecture so that if we are requiring it, it stays.
Right, I think it gets back to, when we say privacy screen not allowed, but obviously code, you have to have a railing at 42 inches. And so when, I think what we did at the last meeting was we just left it at 42 inches and that was going to be the privacy part of it. Because that was the intent of the code at 42 inches and it wasn't brought up, to a 5 or 6 foot tall. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep. And the way it's written now, it's a standard. So that will give us more flexibility to, if you think there should be at a certain height because the neighbors is at a certain height or something like that.
Well, so that begs the question. So the topic came up that the architect said, well, I don't know, what's a privacy screen? Is it 5 foot? Is it 6 foot? Is it 4 foot? And then Sean did his best to try to come up with a number that he thought would work. And and we ended up not agreeing or not settling on a standard. So I think that'll come up again, and until we, as long as we leave it vague, the architects are going to be continually frustrated.
We could say may require up to a 6-foot screen. Okay.
And this would be an
Um,
item that then would be addressed at the review stage, that if it stays status quo or if there's our site review, these are things that we work through and address at that level, right?
Yes.
Like on the last one, I mean, I think that one just kind of ran away, but I think those are the things I was using, for example, that could be worked through so they get here that it's a win-win for everybody at the same time.
Okay, I didn't hear, I think under C, the setbacks work, except we'll make that change to the front to align with the 15 feet. We just talked about the privacy screen. E is for second story deck or balcony, which may not project further than 6 feet from the exterior building wall to which it is attached. That seems to have been working. We got some comments from the last applicant that it's a really small deck. But
The last step, so her 45 square foot deck, right? Is that what she was complaining? I think that was a pretty good example of the issue that we were just talking about, of she was taking. Actually, no, I'm stopping. I think she misunderstood, honestly, because she wasn't taking advantage of her full credit. Is that right?
I'm not sure, but I don't think she had, did she have was there a deck on the front of the home? No. So she wasn't taking, yeah, she didn't utilize the whole 150 square feet, correct, Sean?
It was a little difficult to make a larger deck in that area work, especially on the side. And there wasn't really a space for it on the back because of how they had their great hall kitchen area in the back. So there wasn't really anywhere to attach it in the rear. By putting it towards the side, if they wanted to make it bigger, they were somewhat limited by the fact that they had a 10-foot side setback. And by extending it further back towards the rear of the property would have made it predominantly facing side yard, meaning we wouldn't have allowed it for that reason. So they were effectively, by trying to get a deck there, limited to more or less what they proposed.
So why is it 6 feet? Where did that requirement come from? What problem are we solving? Why can't it just be the setback, whatever it is?
I think it was, well, one thing is originally there was no floor area, right? It wasn't tied to floor area, the second story decks, until we amended them. So we were trying to kind of resolve a couple issues at the same time. So, but the 6 feet was really to make sure that they're not a place that it's not like a big party deck or anything like that, that too much, we were limiting it in size so that the impacts of that deck on the neighbors isn't, if you're gonna have an outdoor event happening, it happens on the ground floor where you're not looking over onto your neighbor's lots. I think the idea was by the 6 feet was really to limit how much happens on a second story deck
But if you have
in terms of social.
you have a second story setback, so you've got an additional 5 feet plus the 6 feet, right? If your second story is set back from your first story, whatever that is, 10 feet, I don't know what the number is. So that's now a 16-foot deck. 16-foot deck.
So you're speaking on the back of the home?
I'm just looking at this requirement. It says, okay, you have 6 feet from the external, I'm assuming that's the ground floor. So it overhangs 6 feet beyond the ground floor. Now you have, if that's a second story deck, your second story is recessed, setback, an additional X number of feet. I don't know what the number is, 10 feet. So now you do have a party deck. It's 10 feet because that's the setback plus the 6-foot overhang.
So off the back of the home, if you're on a 40-foot wide lot, you're required to have two 10-foot setbacks from the side, right? So you could have an area of your home that's 20 feet long on the second story, but the deck comes out 6 feet. So so it doesn't, you don't have to bump in your house. If you were to inset the second story, you're still limited to a 6-foot wide,
From the second story.
depth from the second story wall.
Oh,
Yeah, so from the exterior wall on the second story, you're only allowed to go out 6 feet.
I don't have a problem with party decks.
Oh, but if theoretically, then if you can only protrude 6 feet, but then you could also build into the house over the first story, another 20 feet if you have the FAR allowance.
Yes. you-
Right, so you could have a 26-foot deep deck if you really put the effort into it.
If it were over, yeah, because it says from the exterior building wall to which it is attached.
Right.
So it seems to me that
You could have big sliding doors and open up the whole inside of your house out to this 6-foot deck if you wanted to. And you could,
but you can, it is measured from like the wall to which it's attached. So you couldn't, I'm sorry, I was picturing in Courtney's scenario of the second story being a lot smaller and that you could include, like your deck could include the area over the first story as well as a 6-foot deck. And I don't think that's what this says. I think on the second story, your deck would be, it's 6 feet from the wall of which it's,
Oh. Gotcha.
of the exterior building to which it's attached. So if on your second story it's a lot smaller and you could walk out onto your rooftop, you could only walk out onto 6 feet of that rooftop.
I think that should be
Story.
changed to the 6 feet from the first floor. So you could have a larger deck on this due to the setback, second story.
I think we need to have some
Drawings, yeah.
some examples and things to look at rather than trying to visualize things that we
Yeah.
we can't just all sound like we're Italian. It's there to
Make believe accordion.
But what I'm hearing, it sounds like folks would be okay with having a larger deck as long as it's on top of your house, or no? I'm not sure. Okay, we'll come back with drawings and we'll talk about it. 6 feet, let's see. Roof decks are prohibited in the R1 zoning district. I haven't heard any discussion to change from that. And you can't just have a freestanding deck that's above 30. It's on your, okay.
I'm sorry, just go back. What about a green roofs? A green roof,
Um,
on the second,
I'll have to bring that back to you. I think we have some standards in place for green roofs and required vegetation.
I think it connects in there with, what is that F, right?
Roof decks?
we had green roof before. There was a-
We've had a few green roofs approved. Okay, next topic was the vision for the village, massing, aesthetics, height, and roof decks. And here, I just wanted to bring it back to the our general plan and the goal of ensure a high quality and distinctive design environment in the village. We talk about new development design should really enhance the unique character of the village, maintain our scenic resources, looking at our parking and transportation alternatives, talks about the hotel, and then, but specifically, we had an action item about village design guidelines and to update the village design guidelines to reflect current conditions and encourage new development that enhances the unique qualities of the village. So we did this, and before we had a little handout for the village design guidelines that were they were outdated. And we actually took these guidelines and put them more as objective standards into our zoning code. So on this slide, I show I've got 3 slides that show some of these new standards. The first for the building orientation, that the primary building entrances need to be oriented towards the front sidewalk. Second is the location of parking should be behind storefronts, the required transparency, maximum blank walls of 10 feet are allowed. And then also differentiating the storefront design every 25 feet is a requirement. This is where that height exception comes into place. So we allow additional height within the village for gabled and hip roofs as long as it has a minimum 512 roof pitch and a maximum plate height of 26 feet. And we show how that works. Yeah, and then we say that exterior doors and decks above the 26-foot height are prohibited, so that's really, we've got a roof deck prohibition in the village. And those are the standards. So I think, I'm not sure if I hit upon exactly where, I think Commissioner Jensen asked for this item, and if, I'm not sure if I hit it quite right, but I just wanted to show that we do have some design standards from the village. And I'm not sure if the concern goes beyond the village, and I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, I was just looking at, we hear comments about like the village and aesthetics and everything. So I was just trying to understand, when we see a project come forward, it matches the neighbors, and then, so that's 2, and then it goes to 4. And so as that starts to change, that massing starts to build. And like you lay out, if I understood that correctly, every 25 feet, there has to be a change. But if it's per project, it just could be continuously growing. And so that's what I was concerned about. And I wanted to understand the massing and aesthetics as projects, just if they're continuing built the same way, pretty soon that the whole aesthetics and the massing would really change throughout the village. And it gets to, I think, the comment earlier, what is the quaintness or exact terminology of what the village is. So I think, I think it'd be important to establish what the vision of the village is without locking things down. But, when we look at projects one by one, they do start to build when you put them all together as a total. So that's where that was my comment, when I like to open up for some discussion and see what other commissioners thought about.
Doesn't this figure address that, the storefront widths? You
Well-
can't have the same thing over and over and over again?
Well, for that applicant, right?
No, this would be 3 different buildings, right? So if you have the one, say the one in the middle was the one that was pre-existing, then the ones on either side would have to be not the same. They would have to be, this one's gabled and that one's lower.
Yeah, and that's why I brought it for discussion, because I wanted to be educated about the overall vision and massing of how the village is going to go.
Yeah, my comment on that is I think the village should extend all the way up Capitola Road. Same requirements. But I'm not gonna get boundaries
All the way
changed.
to Bay Avenue.
Yeah. I mean, to me, those are the same buildings, it's all part of, me, that's pretty much part of the village as you're coming in. But I don't expect I'm gonna get boundaries changed, so just a comment.
And I think the Rift Deck thing was just trying to get a better understanding of the project that we looked at across the street. Just, when does 3rd floor roof decks come into play, and just going through that exercise is all I was looking for.
Yeah. The village is interesting, and it's difficult because it's such a mixture. And, when you go back and you look at like the local coastal plan that's really old, there's a whole area down in the village that's designated for residential only. And my recollection is that came about when the philosophy was sort of to have a village. You had to have residential, you had to have, a mix of commercial uses, and that's what gave it its charm, having people who actually lived there. And we've seen that completely change with the vacation rental business, because now, very few of those residential units in the residential designated area are occupied by residents anymore. And, there's always the discussion about, how many more bars can be down in the village, what kind of uses could be there. And I don't have a real good answer for it, but I do think somehow, the city has to sort of maintain a mix down there if it's going to be a village and not just become a food court.
I had a question about the vacation rental issue that Susan's touching on. Why the county's code for vacation rentals are distributed through different jurisdictions, but they're based on a percentage of the frequency of which per block, basically, is my understanding. And based on a certain number per jurisdiction. I think like Live Oak, the Pleasure Point area has like 200 and something. I can't remember the number exactly. And if there's anything left, then they take a next person off the wait list, and it's distributed evenly over the region. So it's not just all concentrated in one area, and then we have a problem where it's, generally vacant because it's just transient people coming in and out. What was the reasoning of the vacation rental ordinance being that you have a grandfathered license just by virtue of living in the village in that one zone, and then it not being allowed anywhere else besides that zone? The reasoning behind it is a little lost on me, because it seems that it creates this issue where there's just nobody living in the village, and it kind of takes away the overall charm and, quality.
I think the prevention is so that that doesn't leak into our single family neighborhoods or our Depot Hill. Because having lived in a tourism industry oriented places my entire career, and seeing in my last city hitting a tipping point of almost 50% of the homes becoming second homes.
Yeah.
It really, that impact of second homes on a neighborhood and that neighborhood small town feel. But I can see both perspectives, but I think that was the reason for concentrating at one area. And I think Susan probably knows the answer better than I, and was involved in that. So
There was a huge outcry from most of the residential neighborhoods that they did not want vacation rentals in those neighborhoods. Partly because they felt it takes away from being a neighborhood, because you never know who's there coming or going. And so as almost more of a compromise, everyone agreed, well, we will have them down in the Central Village area. Probably the mistake that was made was not limiting the number of the residences in the Central Village that could be converted to vacation rentals. But then, we'll have to say on the city's side, they like the vacation rentals because they like the TOT tax and the revenue. So, you're always sort of battling that. But for me personally, I think it's worked really well in Capitola to keep them out of, the adjacent residential neighborhoods. A lot of the neighborhoods are pretty small lots, and, I've rented vacation rentals a number of times myself, and I know when I go there with my family and, kids and extended family, we're on vacation and we're there to party and have fun. And So it's a little different vibe than you get um, in a normal residential neighborhood. But the city, the residents came out really strongly against having them in the neighborhoods.
I think you see a huge influx of ADUs added real quick.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, because that would be the vacation rent.
They're deed restricted. You can't, I mean, they. could
Well,
use-
I'm saying if you expanded the vacation rental.
Oh, no, yeah, I think my thought in saying that is that it seems to distribute the effect over a larger area. So it's not so, you know, there's such a stark contrast between here and just across the street kind of thing. It seems like it would, if there was one or two vacation rentals on every block, it wouldn't seem as noticeable as a large exodus of tourists every winter, and it being empty, in the village area. But it was just a question of what the reasoning was. Why aren't we more similar to other municipal codes in that regard?
And personally, I think you're going to find even more of a backlash against vacation rentals. I mean, it's even starting on a lot of people objecting to second home buyers because as housing gets tighter and tighter, you're going to see more and more restrictions. And I think you're seeing it in places like in the Tahoe area, where they're really cutting back on the number of vacation rentals that are being allowed. So I think Capitola has a good balance with what it has right now, allowing them in the village, but not in other areas.
So going back to my comment on this one, Katie, and I didn't hear a lot of discussion regarding the vision of massing or aesthetics or heights in the villages. So is that just everybody's fine with where we are today? And
Seems like it was a good solution and seems like, it works down there for now.
Yeah, I agree.
Has there ever been any movement on this whole hotel situation?
No, we've definitely I've been very active in reaching out to the hotel and trying to talk them into coming back in, and let's study, like, let's look at a circulation study and talk about your parking garage that was proposed. Some of the items that came up during the conceptual review, but at this time we are not a priority for the hotel. So a parking lot is what we have. So, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the big things that's changed is there was a lot of talk at one point about having a parking structure. And now, because the parking structure was going to allow the hotel to develop, because then they could use the parking and the parking, excess parking in the parking structure. So, it seems like once that went away, the viability for the hotel developer sort of evaporated as well.
They still had claim on 50 spots in the
They
lower
do
lot.
have
Lower lot, I think.
we have kind of an when the lower Pat Cove was developed into a parking lot, there's about 50 parking spaces that are ready. I think there's about 60 actually that are associated just for a hotel in the village with their redevelopment. So that does exist. I think, right now I'm working on the City Hall study, and right now that we're doing all the fact finding, and there have been surveys with staff, and hoping to bring that to our city council in either March or April to kind of give it an idea of like, what is City Hall today? And then what are our projections for the future, projections of population within the city overall, and then asking the city council, do you want us to take this to the next step of looking at options for the future of City Hall and how that would play out? But we're really doing our fact finding now. We're looking at projections now, but I'm hoping March or April. And that's when, if the city council tells us, well, now that we know what it is and that we will probably need to grow in the future, then then to tell our, it's called Group 4 Architecture that's working on it, to tell the consultant, right, let's take this to the next step and come up with a couple different scenarios that could happen at City Hall, but that we would need budgeting for, and we have committed to, let's do our fact finding first before getting into the scenario build out of City Hall. So that, back to Susan's point, if we go into scenarios, I could see that conversation coming back up of,
Right, because we
Reducing
did
order
say the
parking.
lower parking lot's only temporary.
yeah,
It's going to be a park.
it's gonna be a park.
Open it up to the creek.
Yep.
Okay, we doing okay? 8:10, wanna go? Okay, water efficient landscape design and installation. So right now within our zoning code, we reference the water districts, both Santa Cruz Water as well as Soquel Creek Water District. Whenever an applicant comes in with an application, they also have to comply with the standards. I thought I could just go to the district site, show you a paragraph of what their requirements are for landscaping. Their landscaping standards are much more strict or much more in-depth than what we require in our application. So, sorry. So I should go, I thought I skipped a slide there. So the applicability, whenever we have a new single-family home, a landscape plan is required. Also, if the existing landscape is disturbed or a new landscape is added as part of the application, then we also, within this is specific to single families, we require a landscape plan. That landscape plan is required within the hatched areas that you see on the image. So always in the front yard. And then if you're on a corner lot, you have to landscape the exterior side. We don't require the landscaping plan for the rear yard or the interior side yard. And then how that ties in is they also have to comply with the water district standards. And then what is required in a landscape plan? It's pretty much like the site boundary and the placement of buildings as is within the application, but then showing the existing landscaping and trees that will be preserved, any new landscaping that's proposed as part of the development, the irrigation plan, if they're proposing one, the grading, and then I can always ask for more things if we think you're not quite in compliance with the code, just to before we bring it to planning commission to ensure that they're in compliance. So those are the code requirements. And with that, any discussion on landscape plan?
I have a discussion.
Oh,
So right off the bat, it says under landscape 1772-040, it says this purpose is to enhance the aesthetic appearance. And I don't think those words should be in there. I think this landscape plan should not be a plan, but a checklist. So there are requirements that, the Public Works has, obviously the Soquel Creek Water District has. There are practical reasons where you would have, you want permeable surfaces so that we retain our groundwater. You want to have trees that don't block intersections, so you have sight lines. You don't have roots that get into sewer lines or disturb foundations of your neighbors. And you could create a checklist of things that that say here's what your landscape must meet. But to go in and say, like, I'm sorry I brought this up in front of the last applicant, but I felt for the guy who was using every last penny to create his design, and he said, "Well, wait, what? I've got to have a landscape plan? I wasn't even thinking about my landscape yet. I don't know. I'll put in something that meets code. I don't know. Do I have? Well, all right. I guess I'll hire a landscape architect." And I just said, "Oh man, he shouldn't have to have gone through that." And so, like I said, well, how would you have avoided that? Well, if there was a checklist, it says, okay, here's what you have to do. Here are the plants. You can plant these, you can't plant those. And rather than having to either hire a landscape architect or think that, oh, well, gosh, I'm going to try to become my own landscape architect and memorize and learn what all these existing plants are, look up their Latin names and, like, how am I going to do this? I guess I got to hire an expert. Whereas it was a checklist, say, follow, there you go. You meet these requirements.
Are you required to hire a landscape architect or can you do your own plan?
You can do your own plan. We updated that. Based on
Welcome.
your input previously. And it's in our application as the landscape plan is required, but you don't have to hire a landscape architect for it. You can submit.
Right, and so, but I think that that was the misunderstanding of calling it a plan is like calling it, it's a document you gotta create. You have to create it out of your imagination. You got, as opposed to, here are the set of requirements you must meet, which is a lot easier. That's just another, okay, here's another list of municipal code things I have to meet. Right? Now you've got to meet my setback, I have to meet my height requirement, I have to do this. Okay, and here are the landscape requirements. I got to meet this, done. And then you don't need the plan and you can worry about that.
Are you suggesting that we add the list that we have here? These are the requirements. We could have a handout with a checklist for the landscape requirements.
Say, okay, here's the landscape plan, fill this out. Check, 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 check. Okay, I won't do this, I'll do this here.
I think that's what this is pretty much the checklist 1 through 9. And honestly, like the most complicated part about this, I think, because I've done and seen many landscape plans, I feel like there's really not a complex list here except for maybe the irrigation plan, and that needs to be completed just to provide that you're not going to be hosing your property down. I'm assuming like you're not going to overuse water, and that would be part of the WELO document.
Yes, and the requirements for an irrigation plan are much stricter when they go through the Soquel Creek Water District of exactly like what the tie-ins and everything is for,
Yeah, I
So
just,
it's just saying you have to have your irrigation plan, but once you go through the Soquel Creek water, it's much more specific.
So what is on here that isn't already on the drawing? You already have the,
This is what we require.
what
So it's the existing landscaping.
right, so I'm looking at
Proposed.
site boundaries, that's already on the drawing. So you don't need a separate plan for that.
I think maybe what would to aid in what you're giving a checklist like this and then possibly giving a pretty literal example of what other people have submitted, because they're really not complicated. It's like a bubble of showing like bird of paradise, and that you don't have to really call out their Latin name.
But I don't think you should have to pick out your plants.
Well, but at the same time, you're
Do
being fair to your neighbors too, because if maybe you decided just to put ground cover all over it, it's just, I don't know, it doesn't
wrong
really,
with that?
I
What's
mean,
wrong with weeds? It's natural.
but you're advocating for the neighborhoods too.
I understand that you don't want people to do a landscape plan. You don't like landscape plans, but for me, I think the way it's set up now, where you only have to do it for your front yard for most cases, certainly on a corner lot, you have to do the side yard, that you can do your own landscape plan, which is not complicated at all to do, is a reasonable requirement to have. And I think I also think it eliminates confusion at the end when what needs to be done for the whole building site to be signed off and finalized. And certainly they can go back in later and they can move plants around and they can change them, they can add more, they can delete more, but I'm comfortable with requiring, this kind of landscape plan.
And there is that flexibility built into that I can amend. I can accept amendments to the landscape plan, and we do that frequently.
Well, I guess
So-
my concern is I was wondering then, how did this applicant get confused? So if it's just a simple thing like, okay, here's my landscape plan, let me get a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, I'm gonna plant these plants here, boom, 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 there it is.
They seem to be confused about a lot of issues.
I am confused about a lot of issues, and that's why I'm so
Not
thankful that
you, I meant the applicant.
Applicant, they seem to be a little strangely advised.
I think, if I remember that, they were gonna try to keep their existing landscape intact during the project, wasn't it? And so I think that's where maybe more of the concern was that that's probably not really going to be,
There's no possible way. to
yeah,
do
that's not probably not going to happen. And I also like, when you guys do your final sign off, without a plan in place to at least know, like conceptually where things were going to go, other than just a check off list saying shrubs or, certain type of shrubs. I mean, the layout, and what, kind of as you walk around the house and you look at, are the windows in the right spot and the doors in the right spot, kind of a thing. And then you look at the landscape. Isn't it a tool that you guys use as staff too, to plan to be easier than just a checkoff sheet?
Yeah, we'd like to see a plan and exactly where the trees are supposed to be and where the plants are supposed to be. Like I said, we can be flexible, but really just showing, we do review that when it comes in to make sure it's a substantial landscape plan and not just mulch in the front yard. So,
I think it's also good for, well, I think what Courtney was saying with the neighbors, as they look at what the house is going to look like, to also have an understanding to like, you know, what's the overall project going to look like when it is complete? Even though,
We just got.
we have we have had applicants that have, harvested their plants, put them to the side during construction and reutilize their plants. That happens. But really, when we did the update to the code, this first section, we really did rework in terms of just if you're really going to disturb the whole site, we need to see what you're going to bring back. And that applicant could have shown us that they were going to replant the plants they had in the front yard. But once we started looking at what's there and we noticed just this huge stump and just different things that were happening, it was like, well, we need to see a landscape plan because there's no way they're going to do this it's pretty much a tear down rebuild with a few walls staying, that whole front yard was going to have to be re-landscaped. So
they can coordinate that back to like what SoCal Water requires, which is pretty excessive.
mhm.
That really is going to help them, I think, understand what, as they design their house too, what the landscaping or what they're going to be able to do. And, from a landscaping planning that at the same time they're working on their house.
Mhm. So I think what I'm getting out of this is I think we as staff can put together a guidance document on landscaping and what's expected. We've been working on guidance documents, like I said, for new businesses, and that's just something we can offer at our front counter and online.
I think that would be helpful. Again, I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of these applicants who are coming in for the first time and they don't know this process, and you're getting hit with all these requirements, and here's another expense, there's another expense, and yeah, the best we can do to help them out, the landscaping plan can be just a straightforward, easy thing. I think we should we should try to help them.
I think the comments will probably come back a lot more when they look at landscape after you get done going to Soquel Creek, because the requirements that they put in place and what they have to do probably comes back to landscape, and then it looks like from a city requirement standpoint, when it's really the impact from Soquel is pretty excessive.
I can't dictate what Soquel Creek does, but
No, but I think that maybe, and just connecting the comments around, if we talked to an applicant, we did a survey and we said, what's your number one complaint? And they came back around landscaping, it might be more that the requirements around the WELO and what's required from the water company that then reflects onto the city required landscape plan.
fair enough.
I would say that our requirements are probably the most simple out of most cities. Even the county is, it's a multifaceted document that just goes on forever. I think this is so simplified that,
Well, that's a good reference.
So the next layer of landscaping is stormwater. And within stormwater, this is state regulated. It's within our code. We have a section of code 13.16. This is actually reviewed by our public works department. And it's really the philosophy of when rain comes onto your property, you really need to slow it down, try to contain it on your property, and then minimal amount of water should go into the storm drains. So, and also just pollution prevention. So we have, it's by code that we have to meet certain standards within our region. It's broken up by region. And essentially, there are design standards and design measures that are adopted by the city, as well as low impact development design standards. And we're talking about those. It's like water collection, and just different ways in which an applicant can contain their water on their property and get it back into the groundwater rather than getting it out into the storm drain. When an application comes in, one of the first steps we take is we walk the application down the hall to Public Works. They review the stormwater application, which talks about how much of new and replaced impervious area is on the lot. And then from those numbers, depending on how much area, it either becomes a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 project. Tier 1 projects you see all the time in our single family homes, and that's really where we just ask them to do low impact improvements to keep the stormwater on, gutters, drainage, but trying to contain the stormwater on site. Tier 3, we've seen on our larger projects. So an example of a tier 3 project would be the Olive Garden out at the mall, and really they've got a lot of parking area, a building, and really had to create these large retention basins for all their stormwater so that they're keeping it on site and like reutilizing the water as efficiently as possible. So when you get into a tier 3, it's pretty expensive. There's on our website under Public Works, there's a post-construction requirement page if you want to go deeper into this, but it basically, this also just breaks down within the different tiers, what are our requirements. So really just the higher the tier goes, the more requirements you're going to have to meet. And when you get into when you're in a tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 project, those are shipped out to an engineering company that looks at their plans and looks at flows and makes sure it complies with our state regulations. So something that we do, we have got a consultant that looks at that, and it's a pretty major component to all subdivision applications now, because we look at all subdivisions as a whole. And so this is just another layer of what we require of applicants, but we don't really have any flexibility in this whatsoever because it's a state regulation.
Do we have any flexibility in terms of looking at the subdivision as a whole? 'Cause, I mean, like given the Howard's project up the street, that was they split that giant parcel into 3. And that was a crazy drainage system that they had to implement.
Yeah.
And the expense for 2 single family homes and an apartment building just seemed pretty cumbersome for, those 2 brothers to circumvent. So I think that they had to try to do a tier 3, if my memory serves me. But it took up a huge part of their land. I know that we don't have a ton of flexibility, but in terms of our consideration of future subdivisions, especially with all the SB 9, how does that apply? Not that you have to go into too much depth.
Yeah, as far as I know, I don't know of exceptions to SB 9 regarding stormwater, but it is really expensive. It almost killed the Olive Garden project, to be honest. It was because of their site because of the site. The other part of this is we always require this to come in and be compliant before it gets to Planning Commission. We did learn, I think with Olive Garden, at that point, we were conditioning applications, and they'd gone through this whole process, and then they went to stormwater, and then they realized how expensive it was going to be. And it was a nightmare so that is why we make the applicant go through this first. So because it can really influence the design of a project, so.
But the city has no recourse, basically. We're just doing what the state says.
We do exactly what the state says. And we're the The Santa Cruz region, I believe, has the strictest standards in the state, which
And I suggest for all of us, if you haven't gone and looked at it, the project that Courtney's referring to is the one that got built up here on Capitola Avenue with the apartments and the 2 residential. It's worth going up there and looking, particularly on the side, I think, where the 2 residential units are, how much of the site is taken up with stormwater retention areas on that site. It's worth checking out because it's extensive.
it really impacts the front yard.
It
Yeah.
cost, just the engineering alone was close to like $70,000, I think. It is a lot of money for just the implementation, construction, preparations. I mean, all of it. I just, I don't know how to change it on the state level or how, if that's like really what the reasoning behind it was or is on that higher level. I don't know. Anyway, thank you.
It's sort of like our new housing element.
Right.
It's like, let's make everything cheaper, but we've got all these requirements,
Yeah.
so there's no way to make it cheaper. But
Thank you.
so the topic 9 is the massing. I'd like to hold off on this one. I really think Paul actually asked for this item, and I would love for photos of, or any, you can just take Google Earth pictures, whatever, or send me addresses, but I think it would be a fun exercise to go through some what you think is good and bad massing, and we can talk about why. And then just tying it back, you'll be looking at floor area ratio and heights to really control massing and setbacks, but those are the tools we have. And some of our objective standards of like when a mass, having steps in buildings and that type of thing. But the next topic is opaque windows on second stories. And right now, the only criteria we have is our design review criteria and privacy. We talk about the orientation and location of buildings, entrances, windows, doors, and decks, and other building features minimize privacy impacts on adjacent properties and provide adequate privacy for project occupants. So with that, who would like to start with opaque windows?
Oh, Peter.
Your comment about you have to design not just for the existing neighbors, but all future neighbors. You never know when a neighbor is going to build a house that's going to be across a window. So that means all second story windows should be opaque because you never know when the next neighbor is going to build a house that has a sight line into your bathroom or whatever. I think the notion of the opaque windows is similar to the second story decks and the privacy issue. There may be many instances, in fact, where you'd need opaque windows, but for the most part, I don't think they should be required. I mean, there should be a rare exception.
I agree. I think if we were to do anything, if we were to make any suggestions, I think that our solution to the screening discussion with saying instead of using the words shall as the operative, I maybe using may, just to give the commission, neighbors, the applicant recourse to make it a further discussion of privacy.
So I think one of the important components in it is the original design, the beginning design of the new building that's going to be built. Because what we're talking about is, an infill building going in. So the neighbors next door, they're already there. Their windows are fixed. They're there. So, having one of the components that gets looked at in the original design, when it comes into the city is how is it going to impact, to have a window that looks directly into a neighbor's window. Those things can easily be moved in the beginning of the design process. So I think it's something that's important for staff to look at when you're talking to an applicant and, figuring out how you can design this building so it can go in and you don't need to have opaque windows. It seems like where they often come up is in bathroom windows because, somebody wants to have them there. And for me, I don't have any difficulty with them going into bathroom windows. I think people usually sort of, screen the bottom part of their windows in their bathroom anyway with some curtains or something like that. So I think it's all part of the design review process that, in certain instances. I think where we've had some discussion about it has been with ADUs because they don't go through the same process. And so, and we also allow them to be closer to the setback lines. So suddenly we were having ADUs that were being built with a second story 3 feet away from the backyard of the neighbor looking into it. And I think in those kinds of cases, it's important to have, some privacy considerations and, opaque windows seem to be an easy way to solve that problem if, that's the case. So I don't think it's, opaque windows everywhere. And again, it seems that we need to have it a little more fine detailed about, are we talking about ADUs that are going to be a couple feet from the parking lot? Are we talking about a residential unit that's going to be 10 feet away? I mean, those are different scenarios. So I don't think it's a black and white issue.
Yeah, yeah, to add on to that would be like the word may and what the overall design is. And then if that's done early in the project, because right now, how's the process you guys handle when a project comes in to evaluate the opaque windows?
Yeah, it's case by case. There's no requirement in the code except for the ADUs, because those are administrative review. But it's case by case. So recent applications in which there's a 2-story really close to a property line in which the other house is really close, or if it's these tighter neighborhoods, we'll typically recommend that opaque windows. But we can look at that a little bit differently and say in our staff report, like we mentioned to the applicant, that the planning commission may require opaque windows. But if, I'll give the example of across the street where the other home was along Riverview is really close to 417, 419 Cap Ave. In that scenario, we, not along the stair, I think the staircases, we didn't require the opaque, but just where the bedrooms were like overlooking someone's backyard, requested opaque. So
I feel like there's not a lot of combative applicants that, I mean, if you suggest something saying, maybe this would be a good idea, they seem to, I mean, given the option, maybe they wouldn't make it opaque, but if it means their application's going to go through seamlessly, I don't feel like there's been too many applicants that have had a problem with it,
I think we had 2 that we
erased it.
removed that as a contingency just last year. So I think we've discussed it. So not a ton of times, but I just know 2 of them. I think there are only 2 that came forward that is written in staff comments, and then we have the discussion, then we remove it. I'm trying to streamline the process. So, I think one thing I try to work very closely to understand is the recommendation comes from staff and they're following guidelines, and then it comes to a discussion here and then it's overturned, and it's not a negative comment to staff. They're doing a great job and trying to, follow a certain process. And then we not arbitrarily, maybe we haven't even gone out to the project to look at exactly, and, the applicant says, I don't want it, and then we're overruling. So I'm just trying to, I think with my standpoint, I was trying to have a baseline of consistency across the board as a starting point, and so that it's not an item discussing an opaque window on somebody's project.
yeah, we really try to look at the neighbor's windows and really what's going on around it before we would go to the recommend. It wouldn't be just, we think you should have opaque because they've got a backyard.
I know the one
Really,
that-
What was
I'm
the,
thinking about
what was the deal we had, the one
On
of your,
Escalona?
where they wanted to have an ocean view even, and the neighbor who was even had a set, they
I was
were,
on the one at Escalona, I think.
yeah, and nevertheless, somehow they ended up with this opaque window that they felt that.
I thought, was it
needed.
in the kitchen? It was in the kitchen, right?
Breakfast nook or something.
Yeah, and so, and I don't think we should use like one exact, to try to set, but I think those are just things I try to look at and we could streamline or understand if there's, and maybe it's even maybe something for you guys to bring back and say, maybe there was something that we missed in what the staff's recommendation was behind that on why that was. I think if I remember correctly, it was about they were gonna be looking down into the neighbor's front yard. I thought. I forget. Do you remember?
Yeah, well, I thought I remember that was the neighbor 2 doors away was complaining.
Yeah.
I remember one opaque window with the code enforcement of they had installed like an illegal.
I think that was on
Was different.
Saxon.
That was Saxon.
That was one on Saxon. I think that was that one, but the other one was on Escalona. I forget.
But anyway, so that's your point, I guess, is that we just need to make sure that we don't, we're not over enthusiastic about these things. But so there are cases when, again, if you've got two houses butting each other and there's there's an opportunity to place a window here or 5 feet over, yeah, move it or make opaque glass. I mean, that's pretty reasonable. But some the Escalona example is like, well, how did we get into that recommendation? That's kind of over the top. So again, somehow specifying exactly when opaque windows are required, or just have more of an agreement, because this notion of saying, well, we may overturn it. Boy, it's like now all of a sudden we're putting a lot of burden on staff to try to guess whether or not we're going to overturn this, or I hate to put that on you.
We do have it in the ADUs. And for me, that's an important one because that doesn't go to any administrative body to review. I mean, that's just basically it's an over-the-counter permit if you meet certain requirements. So, in that case, I think the instances of requiring opaque windows in certain situations, the wording should be in there that they're required. And again, because they're closer to the property line and usually, the ADUs being built in someone's backyard, closer to the neighbor. When it comes to, single family residential projects that are going to come to the planning commission, then I think it's fine to change the language in there and go to may instead of shall. And then that way they can be evaluated on an individual basis, looking at, what the circumstances is on that particular application.
So how that would work would be if it is now staff would say, well, here is a topic that might be contentious. You may put in opaque windows, or you may choose not to, but it may come up in the planning commission. Is that how you'd address that?
So how it would be done, because we don't have a standard it's only for ADUs. So where it falls is under that privacy standard. So during our development and design review meeting, we would say to the applicant, if their window was at the 3-foot setback, but aligned with the next window next door at the 3-foot setbacks, they're looking right into each other. It's like, well, we've got a concern with this window. We have seen situations in which that the planning commission will require an opaque window. We do usually say if it's a bathroom that we think it should be opaque or at least covered halfway. But we could take a different approach of just highlighting it as a concern within this standard and say to the applicant, we're going to bring this up in the report that there is another window 6 feet away and they line up. And then the planning commission during their meeting might require it to be opaque. That's not having an opaque window is not a big deal compared to having to move a window, like cost wise. I'm thinking if that change occurs, that's pretty simple. But what I think I'm hearing from the planning commission is you'd prefer the flexibility of it and to kind of, we'll warn them and then they can decide if they want to address the privacy concern, or the planning commission may require it.
I think across the board, providing that door for discussion for those types of issues, like the guy up on Depot Hill that the neighbor didn't want him to have his chimney so close to the property line, you, and he was happy to omit he put the chimney on the interior side, I think it was, or something. He came up with a different solution. I just feel like having those types of points embedded in their standards that will open the conversation, allow for deliberation, and then bring the points up that might be contentious as, the application progresses kind of thing. Yeah. That seems fair.
Okay. So no real changes there, just the delivery. Okay. We've made it much further than I thought we were going to make it tonight. So thank you.
Well,
So-
Paul's not here. No, just.
Chatterbox.
Peter's losing his voice.
Peter's losing his voice. All right. So this one I think we captured, but I'm not 100% sure in our village discussion, but aesthetic guidelines regarding character of Capitola. I think a few people made comments about wanting to talk about aesthetics, and I wasn't sure if it was just towards the village or if this is a separate discussion, but what it really comes down to is is just the design guidelines and us looking at the design guidelines, looking at the surroundings, because a lot of the guidelines have to do with the surrounding neighborhood and how the design fits. I often think of within our neighborhoods, you're really looking at like the braille of the community. And if a building, like thinking about how the structure fits within the neighborhood and how it relates to a sidewalk and the overall height and the massing and the scale relative to the, within the block are things that we really try to look at when we talk about aesthetics. I think aesthetics is a pretty general term. So I could see like, but really looking at like local vernacular and that type of. So that's where that's headed. We have our design criteria, I want to say over about 20 different criteria. So it's really all encompassing in there. But that's what we really look at is like what's surrounding and how does it fit.
I think it came, it seems like every time a project comes in that maybe pushes the envelope, right? Then the first comment that community makes is doesn't aesthetically fit into the surrounding area. And so I know it's not something I think this group or anybody's gonna be able to come to agreement on what is aesthetic guidelines, but it seems like my example earlier, and not just using the example across the street, the report comes back after it says, and the project fits in because the next door neighbor's house, it's designed about the same way. And then the next time that the next house comes in, then last two houses, have, and so that the aesthetics can change real fast, as projects improve. So, I just wanted to bring up just because I hear so much, and that's like the buzzword, aesthetic character of the village and everything. And then what is that? I mean, I don't know what that is, but I mean, it's concerning as things can change and maybe they are, and that's good, and it's a common theme. So.
I think the aesthetic character of the village has to do with sort of the size and scale of the village. And, certainly architecturally, there's all sorts of different architectural styles down in the village in those work, but it has more to do with the massing and the size and the scale and the setbacks and, how the building fits in.
So I think it's it's a problem because it depends on planning commissioners. We have a different set of planning commissioners. They're going to have a completely different set of ideas of what aesthetics mean. So if we can do something like, specify the kinds of words that you all just said, and here's what aesthetics means, and not, again, style. I don't like modern. I don't like this. I don't like craftsman. I don't, you know, that's what aesthetics, to me, that's what aesthetics is. And so that's very subjective. But the kind of words you're using are a little bit more objective. And so that's more comforting, or that's easier to deal with than saying, oh my gosh, I don't know what kind of planning commissioners I've got this year, but roll the dice.
But I think that's the nature of cities and politics, and they change continually. I think that as the community's opinions change, different people get elected, they appoint different people. That's part of the evolving process. And just as there's groups that would like to, write regulations where absolutely nothing can ever change, those people aren't successful in doing it that way, just as the people aren't successful in saying, oh, I'm worried it's going to change because I'm not here. That's sort of the nature of planning and growth and evolution and how cities evolve and become what they are.
I look at the project that, I don't know the exact address, but, the Pizza My Heart project, the one building, but I thought our group did a great job in giving some feedback. I thought that applicant did a great job of coming back. 'Cause at first, the first one looked like they were all kind of the same. I thought we were pretty clear with wanting definition between, and I don't know, you go down there now, you're like, to me, I'm like, that was a huge improvement. It fit in, and it's a huge improvement, and there's some changes, but then again, we changed the aesthetics because you go back and look at some of the old pictures, right? It doesn't really look like that, but we did, and then with the new patio coverings or whatever, little mansard covering that extends down in front of, what is that, the Mai Tai or whatever. It looks great, and so but that aesthetics changed. So I think that was still positive. So
I think the difference is in that case, you just can't, you gave them, or we gave them, broader guidelines, which was like, we want differentiated storefronts. We didn't go into details of this is the material, or this is the size of the overhang, or I prefer brackets instead of, the kinds of things that are also aesthetic requirements. And so I guess to your point, it kind of depends on the planning commissioners. Unfortunately, you guys are pretty good.
I think again, I just think it's really important to have that open door for discussion. So depending on that, I mean, if we had a different set of planning commissioners, it would have been a completely different conversation. But I feel like having the conversation is the important part. So then as the people cycle through in and out of of the group, you can pull from, well, they did this last year, they did this like 10 years ago. And seems like,
yeah, I think the hardest thing is that I do think basically all property owners and all applicants need to be treated equally and fairly. And what you don't want to see happen is that they're just because of who somebody is or whatever, that they get special treatment and special privilege. It really needs to be a system where everybody, is treated fairly, and you want to have enough rules that sort of ensure that they are treated equally and fairly. But things change. I mean, I said the other night, the project that got built up here on Capitola Avenue, where there's the sort of modern apartment buildings. For me, they work in that particular location They're completely different from everything that's in the neighborhood, but they're well designed and it works. And some of it has to do with, design and taste, and you're never going to completely eliminate that when you talk about planning and design review, and I've never seen it eliminated in any community.
The state seems to want to do that, right?
Right.
They came in and said, let's get rid of the subjective requirements because that's an opportunity to deny a project. So make your planning codes objective, right? Isn't that our
Yep.
charter? So,
And next you'll see communities go away.
well,
I think like,
it just seems it's a shame that that it depends on when you have a project. You'd hope you go to staff and say, okay, staff gives you all the requirements. I met all the requirements is what I like, and then you just it's a crapshoot. You go in front of the planning commission. You don't know what you're in for.
Well-
You don't want to be you want your expectations set. You don't want to be surprised after you've just spent a fortune on a drawing set.
I think I think I just want, or maybe someone else brought this up, but I just wanted to have the conversation about that. As a planning commission, we talked about the aesthetics and we talked about the village, not to change anything, but just that we looked at things and things evolve, and maybe every couple of years we just touch on the topic of looking at how many more things have changed, and are we getting away from aesthetic guidelines, but going back to make sure everybody's treated fairly and everything, and the same is extremely important, and that there's not different treatment for different people. I think that's just where I was coming from, to just open up so that as people use that, the aesthetics of the village are changing, and, we don't like flat top roofs, or we don't like, I think you were saying Spanish tile, Peter. But I mean, yeah, but I mean, I think it's just key to talk about these things and make sure that we all in sync, that we don't think that it is changing to a severe degree.
Just wait till there's a hotel project.
Oh my
We'll
gosh.
hear.
I hope there's a hotel project.
I think
What people do.
the two places in which we could have aesthetic guidelines that are really prescriptive are Lawn Way, because Lawn Way has a very defined architecture in it, and as well as the Venetian Court. I think just as things change there, just to have guidance, because there are historic districts. They're protected because they're historic districts for flood purposes and being rebuilt. But that's one area where like the materials really are, just to have really clear guidelines on what you can and can't do in terms of windows, stucco, or that's a place where it really,
Pearls in it.
it really matters. But
That's a historic district, though. That's different.
that's a district, but that is a place where aesthetic, like very clear guidelines could go a long way for anyone that owns a property there to know what they can do with their property in the future, just to, okay, one more. I think, yeah, okay, this is the last item
Okay.
of our zoning topics. Variances in California Government Code section. So this, when you read the government code section, which I have on this slide, it's almost verbatim it pretty much is verbatim within our variance section. So we're required by state law, when we look at a variance, that they can only be granted when there's, because of special circumstances applicable to the property, including size, shape, topography, and it goes on and on and on. You've heard those words, you've seen them in a million staff reports. That comes right out of state law. Also, when granting a variance, it shall not constitute a grant of special privilege inconsistent with the limitations upon other properties in the vicinity and zone in which the property is situated. So this is direct out of state law. We did add 3 other criteria to our variance standards to be a little bit more specific in ensuring that it, I think, complies with the Coastal Act, or coastal, and then probably our general plan and zoning. I'm not quite sure what the other 2 are, but we go a little more in depth, which we're allowed to do, but these standards have to be in our code by law, and that's why they're there. And the other thing is the variance can never be used for a land use. So you could never say, we're gonna allow a Wendy's in a residential neighborhood just because everyone in that neighborhood really loves Wendy's and wants to drive through in their neighborhood. But we could never allow a variance for that because it's prohibited by code to allow a variance for a land use. And that just brings in predictability for someone when they buy a property and knowing what is allowed. And with that, I think, Susan, you requested this item, and I don't know if it was just so everyone's aware or if there was more to it that you wanted to discuss.
Yeah, mainly I think it's for everyone to be aware. I mean, I think people want to grant variances because they like a project or they want someone to do it. And, legally to grant the variance, it really does have to do with the lot itself. It's not that the neighbor next door got to do something or 14 houses in those 2 block areas got to do something or something that was done before. I think we get a little lax with following what is the law because people say, oh, well, I like their design. They're such nice people. I want to let them, do this. And I think in those situations, we need to look at amending our zoning ordinance if, we want to change how we do things. But we really do need to follow the state law when it comes to granting variance. I mean, we
Used to keep us on,
I know.
yeah,
by golly, when he was on here.
It's like, why?
and he is right. And it's been a while since the city's been sued, but we'll be sued again over those kinds of things.
Okay, our broader topics. I think we can hit on a few of these because the first one I think is more of an update from me on Zoom
Right.
and oral communications. So our city clerk reached out to a lot of different cities, got information on who is and who is not using Zoom. And it's still the trend that most people have cut Zoom communication in terms of public comment out of, we're not utilizing it because of all the Zoom bombing that was happening. The thought here is that Julia is reaching out to the same communities again, and this recently went to City Council in January. And they wanted to see come back in a couple months. So I think in April she's due to come back and see where people are at in terms of Zoom. And for the Planning Commission, we'll just follow suit of what our City Council does. So if they decide to reopen Zoom for public comment, we would too, unless if the Planning Commission, we could discuss that, but that's originally what we had agreed to when we cut off the meetings, is we'll just follow suit of City Council. The other item, and I actually incorporated this into our agenda this evening, is that the City Council adopted a 30-minute maximum in terms of oral communications made by the public at the very beginning of the meeting during oral communications. It says, now a maximum of 30 minutes is set aside for oral communications. I'm sure you've seen or heard some of the trends. There was a really late meeting that occurred at the city of Santa Cruz recently till 4 a.m. I think that was it was definitely on a specific item during communications, but this is just to, if we were to have a lot of people come in and want to discuss things during oral communications that would go beyond a half hour, we could take a raise of hands, see how many people are here for oral communications this evening. And if we see 60, we could, or 30, we could say, okay, you each have 1 minute to speak on your item, just to make it more efficient. And so that was the first item.
Would that be like by project? I mean, or topic?
So by project, we have the 3-minute maximum. So
Sometimes by topic. So it's,
Just, there's been a couple cases where, people have come in and oral communications has gone on for like 2 hours. And it's not about a specific
Right.
project. It's just topic. And personally, I think that's a little disingenuous to all the other people who are here to do business because nothing can take place. It's sort of like the Zoom bomb. So what I've seen is cities limit it to, 30 minutes for oral communications in the beginning. They often say, we'll continue this at the end of the meeting. So, everybody can have an opportunity to speak, but that way it gives you a chance to go ahead and start your meeting and do the business that needs to be done that evening, rather than have the meeting taken over by something unexpected.
Okay.
And I think that's why the council did it. They've done it as well.
Well, I like the idea of continuing it to the end of the meetings, because I can see maybe there are some serious issues that, maybe there's like 4 different issues and there's a lot of people wanting to talk on all 4 of them. And 30 minutes they're gonna, it might not be enough. So, I'd say, well, okay, well, we've given you 30 minutes. If you want to wait till the end of the meeting, we'll throw another 30 minutes at it, or hour or whatever. I think that
And
makes
I think
sense.
we only let somebody speak once for 3 minutes,
Right.
regardless of how many issues they want to talk about.
Next is upcoming projects and how we communicate that. Sorry, upcoming projects and how we communicate that to the planning commission. I try to do that during the director's report. Tonight, I actually have got during the director's report, I have an update for the next 2 planning commission meetings, what we're seeing. But I think, Jerry, this was one of your items, and how we could better accommodate.
I was just looking at as projects come in, or discussion come in, so that as planning commission, we could see maybe trends or things that are way far down the line. I think, I sense of one just talking about, I think, the alcohol licenses and stuff like that. And, so like when we saw December, whatever it was, for Mijo's Tacos, to know, and I think you brought up maybe a concern, like how many do we have? And so to know that the city might be talking to potential 10 other applicants that might be bringing them in over the next year, and they're looking at different leasing spaces. To have the understanding of a trend or where things are going would be helpful. So, and as projects come in, do we see lately a whole bunch of people are checking in with the city and talking about ADUs from a trend, or has there been a rush on developers coming in and talking with planning about potential low-income housing, or and so just trying to understand trends more so than of looking forward. So I guess I'm trying to be more involved as planning, looking forward, over the next 12 months, and maybe not understanding that maybe you don't have a lot of people coming in, but is there trends or are there projects that are coming up that are that people are inquiring about, or certain properties or something like that, to better understand that, so that can be shared, or it can be in our back of our mind as we're looking at projects, or how things might be changing or what the future looks like. So that's where my comment was regarding that.
Okay. I can try to incorporate that more into my director's report with trends and.
Copying us on a lot of the high points of city council. I know that a while back we had the big panel where it was us, and the council member that appointed us. If it feels, I know that we're always forwarded the agendas and everything, but having the high points summarized is really helpful, because it gives you context and application. Like the Bulb Avenue project, it's interesting to talk with council about that stuff, because there's a history to it, and then there's, all different kinds of detail. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Friday update I'll start sending out weekly.
Yeah.
The other is
always
Oh,
sent
yeah.
out, because it always has a summary of what the council took action on in it. That one I
Do
find
you,
pretty
do you all get that, the newsletter?
The Capitola Way. Yeah.
Yeah, because that,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's nice to have a really succinct summary of the high points of decision making on that level. And even just like upcoming stuff of what just staff is looking at, just not even so we can be prepared to make decisions, but just to
Mhm.
give overall context of where the city's going and what to anticipate and how to kind of keep up with it, how to curate our decision making based, like what Jerry was saying, maybe with hypothetically speaking, just the alcohol in the bars and stuff like that. Just understanding what the intentions of the city is and being able to make a decision based on that is helpful.
Okay.
I think like my example I use at last meeting, you read in the paper that they're gonna start serving alcohol out of the mercantile, at that where Little Kehoe's Bites or something was, knowing that if that was in, like it's already advertised in the newspaper and or an article written about it, and no one could control that, but knowing like was that project discussed earlier in October about that space maybe coming up, and maybe that could have skewed the conversation around. Well, now we're gonna give Vihos one. We got one coming in here. Like just understanding that the flow of projects are coming. I guess that's where it's going.
Okay. Um, Next is historic districts, relationship to FEMA, and interest in preservation. And just so you're all aware, within a historic district, when you have a historic district, which we have, I believe, 4 within Capitola, at one point, Depot Hill was looked at, but then didn't become a historic district. Um, there are leniencies within FEMA for properties within historic districts. So by having our historic districts and keeping them intact, we have protections on those homes that they can be rebuilt within the floodplain. So where in other places it's not a guarantee. So that was one point, I think, just to make the point that there's a true, it's not just historic preservation, but there's also a tie-in for it's a real community benefit in that we can keep our historic district around because of the relationship to FEMA. And then interest in preservation. And I think this is Susan wanted to discuss.
Yeah, I brought that up because, and I think that's, we see in a lot of the documents, it talks about, preserving Capitola history and, how people feel about that. Because I do think, I agree with Katie. I think keeping the historic districts is important. The Six Sisters are one and Lawn Way is one. And if those buildings got destroyed, the only thing that could be rebuilt are buildings that are elevated about 12 to 13 feet above the ground. And by preserving our historical districts, we preserve the right to, if they want to, they can rebuild the way they are. So I think it's important. We sort of sometimes people poo-poo historical preservation, but it does have its place and its benefits here in Capitola.
And I will say of our historic districts, the one that's most at risk right now of remaining a historic district is the Riverview Historic District because of just how many changes have been made. And infill matters in historic districts, what you build in between the historic buildings and how they relate to the historic. You never want them to mimic or copy a historic building, but they should fit within the mass and the setting. So we are at one point, I think Leslie Dill was out and we walked the neighborhood and she voiced to me her concern of, we're kind of getting closer. So that talk about possible design guidelines in the future, something to protect these historic districts is probably within our, once we get through some of the implementation that we need to do for the housing element, should be, it's definitely on my list of items of things we should be considering in the near future. With that, I'm not prepared to give you a presentation on builder's remedy. That was something that Paul had asked for. And by the time I got to slide 65 and sent it out to you all ahead, I said, so not ready for the builder's remedy. The quick and the short of it is that Veronica Tam, who we rely on heavily, a lot of cities have had a lot of inquiries about builder's remedy. We have not had as many inquiries, and it's really, we do allow housing in all of our zoning districts except for industrial. And we also require a 15% inclusionary, where builder's remedy requires a 20% inclusionary, so the standard is higher. So there's not much of an advantage to going forward with the builder's remedy project in Capitola as there is in other places where they don't allow housing in commercial areas. So, but I'm happy to gather more information on builder's remedy, but I'm not prepared tonight. So with that, we made it through all our items. Thank you all for bringing these forward and the conversation tonight. Very helpful.
Just one question with the builder's remedy. What's your estimated time until you think that the housing element goes back? And like, how long are we in builder's remedy, do you think?
Great question. So housing element, our next step is that we'd like to move forward with red lines to give to the state. We're asking for a conditional approval in which they would redline the document back and tell us exactly what needs to be modified rather than these back and forth letters. And then we would take that red line version to the city council. We've met with them recently. Veronica Tam and her team have been working on the modifications. I told them I do not feel comfortable putting a 75-foot height in until I've taken this to planning commission and city council. So that's really, we're having these 2 meetings. So after that, I think we're going to proceed with, we'll post it on our website, but also submit it to HCD. Because if we were to go through the adoption process, there's a 6-week period, and I think we're better served. That's the big question, was the height. Better served to get that back to the state in terms of not wasting too much time and get it certified sooner. So that is the plan.
A crystal ball?
Crystal ball. Oh, we will, once we get our red lines, we definitely have to go through the noticing periods, which takes about 3 weeks in advance before a planning commission meeting, and then another 2 weeks in advance before a city council meeting. So once it goes 60 days HCD review, red line comment back, and then it's beginning to end probably a 2-month period for adoption because of noticing requirements.
You're hoping sometime this summer, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 120 days. So from the time we get it in, so that's after the next city council meeting. So, yep. So with that concludes my presentation. I do have some director report items for you.
I think it was very helpful, and it was actually kind of like comforting to understand where you're all coming from and to get a better perspective and some history. And yeah, I feel really good about this conversation.
So some of those items will be like agendized, and you'll bring those back that we had further questions on?
Yes. So what will happen next is when I bring them back, they'll be in the form of an ordinance, and we'll have to notice that for public hearing. So we'll work on the draft. I do want to have one more work session meeting with the planning commission because we have a long list of, actually the list got longer. Ben looked at the housing element and went through again. He said, "Oh, Katie, I found a few more items to add to your list." So we've got housing element items, and then we also have a list of staff changes that we think need further clarification. So we'd like to do one more work session on that. And I'm thinking a special meeting only because it looks like our next 2 public hearings will be plenty of applicants. So
I have one I think we should think about. My recollection is that we put in the zoning ordinance requirement that you can't have a motorhome parked in front of your property. And now the state has changed that and said, you can do that.
Oh, I'll have to check.
So if that's the case, that's one more we should clean up in our zoning.
Okay. There was one more that I thought of recently as well, for flat work in front yards. Is that another one that, of when a permit is required? We oftentimes get calls that people are like paving their front yard. There's no requirement for a flat work permit. But we have all these stormwater requirements, we've got landscaping requirements, but there's no permit. So looking at that as just like an admin, check a box. Okay. So I do think it would prevent a lot of the headaches of when we run out to them and say, whoa, what are you doing? Okay. Any other items for code related stuff? No. Okay.
One thing, I think I had a lot of conversation with Brian about in the past, was, like on demo projects, making sure that there's J number issuance and stuff like that. I think, you guys have handled that more so from administrative level. Should that be a little bit more defined for applicants when they come in, about receiving a J number for hazardous
So-
waste and stuff?
We did update our information for what's required for a building permit submittal and put that in there. So that's online now. Okay, shall we move on to the director's report?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
I'm sleeping. in.
Okay, I've got a list of items. So first, I'd like, the city clerk reminded me today at our staff meeting that to please complete your Form 700. You should have gotten a specific email. I think it populates what you put in last year, so it's pretty easy. And if you haven't had any changes, please do that as soon as possible. I asked her if she could resend the emails to anyone that is still has them out there so that you don't have to go through. I know I get plenty of emails on my personal email. So,
No, I had to request mine, the one I filled out last year, so she just sent mine. It went to spam, but I just got it yesterday, I think, so I'll have mine taken care of this week.
let me know if you haven't gotten it because we can get that for you.
I'm the one she's talking about. It's me.
Have you done it? Yeah. It's Jerry.
Jerry.
It's our
A-
problem.
And Paul. Paul's not here.
Okay. So I was brainstorming a special meeting date for the next work session. I was wondering if we could look at calendars for that. And I've got the availability here. I'm thinking February 15th may be too soon. That is an open Thursday, but there's our next meeting is March 7th. Yeah. The 22nd, we have a city council meeting. Maybe the 19th looks like it's open for, that's a Monday, the 19th.
Monday, the 19th is President's Day.
Oh, yeah, that's not a good.
It's a holiday. City Hall's closed that day.
City Hall's closed that day. Would the 15th work for folks if Ben and I can get it all together before then? I think it would be kind of informal like this if we would, we're not going to draft anything for it, but just bring the, let you know what the issue is and what we need to get done and get some, like in
15th of February.
15th of February. Would that work?
I can make it work.
Courtney, does that work for you? Yeah. Okay, let's tentatively place it for the 15th. We will also be probably putting together a special meeting for the 1098 38th Avenue project, which is the affordable housing project, and we were tentatively looking at April 18th. So if you could let me know if that doesn't work, and then we can look for other dates. Otherwise, if you could hold that in your calendar. April 18th.
I probably will not be able to make that. My daughter's expecting that day.
Oh. Where are your priorities, Peter? No, I'm just kidding.
Will there be more discussion about that project then?
No, I think that would be the first time that it would make it to planning commission. There's quite a few studies being done. We can look at other dates though, if it doesn't work. So it sounds like I'll put out an email because it's that far out in advance. Okay. Strategic plan, I had told you there will be a presentation to city council next week. The zero emission passenger rail and trail next week on February 8th. One update is that the Cliff Drive Resiliency Project has begun, where they're looking at long-term solutions to preventing further erosion on the bluff in Cliff Drive. So we're expecting, I believe we're looking at future community meetings, possibly the last week of February. So I think Jessica's working with the consultant right now to figure out a schedule, but there'll be a community meeting and trying to get public input on just the issues and possible solutions for Cliff Drive. So you can look forward to that the week of the 25th of February. And then upcoming applications that we've received at the March 7th meeting. I'm going to give an update on our housing program and just kind of the overall housing element, what we saw for development in the last year, because our numbers are due to the state, and then what our program is for the upcoming year in order to get items accomplished that are required under the new housing element. We have an application right across the street on our favorite block of redevelopment, 413 Capitola Avenue. It's the single family white, it was Richard Amy's office. It's actually not a single family right now, it's supposed to be an office. Converting that to a single family home with the living on the second story and outside the floodplain. That will be coming before you. 203 Fanmar. There's an addition, second story addition, and then also the Capitola Wharf design modification and the modification to the CDP. So that'll be coming back to you. Then looking ahead to April 4th, the Mercantile, we've received an application for a tasting room for a beer tasting, as well as they want to utilize another suite so that people can buy their goods to go. So, and then 700 Hill, this is the hotel site. In looking for financing, they need to split that lot so that they can be sold individually in the future. Having a hard time getting financing without the lot split. So most likely a lot split will be on the agenda for April 4th, and then 210 Fanmar, which is also proposing an addition. So a lot going on in the Fanmar neighborhood. And then that's all I've got. And I really appreciate all your input tonight. Thank you.
Question, did you hear anything more about the rumor mill from Central Fire about fire station locations and stuff?
So I did, I understand that the produce market, I don't think it's that site. I think the produce market was given the opportunity to buy that site. So they're actually like reinvesting into their, I ran into the sister of the previous owner the other day. And so she said the owner there is reinvesting in that site. So from what I can tell, I think I have not heard from Central Fire directly, but I think it would be possibly the bank site. But I'm not sure. Bank?
The bank? The bank.
Possibly, if it's at that corner.
There's some community surveying going on about fire station location.
I'll call and ask about that. know. Mm-hmm. Sean, is there any interest from In and Out on that? You,
We haven't received any inquiries from In-N-Out or even fast food. We've received some inquiries about that site, but none for a fast food chain.
coffee?
Coffee was one. It sounds like that might be out.
Is that it for the director's report?
That is.
Okay, so I think we're adjourned. Is that
Until March.
March 7th, 2020?
Yes.